I booked an Airbnb in New York City for a short getaway with my wife. We had both been working nonstop for months and needed some time to relax. When I found the listing, it seemed perfect. The pictures showed a cozy cabin tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, offering the peace we craved, but still close enough to the city's attractions. The reviews were glowing and the price was reasonable. Everything seemed right, so I booked it without a second thought. The first few days were peaceful. The cabin was everything we hoped for, comfortable and quiet. We spent our days walking around the city and enjoying the sights, then coming back to the cabin to unwind. It was exactly what we needed. On the third night, though, everything changed. It was late, and I was in the kitchen making a cup of tea while my wife was in the bedroom reading. The soft hum of the kettle boiling filled the room, and I was about to pour the water when I heard her scream from the other room. "Come quick," she shouted. My heart raced as I dropped everything and rushed to the bedroom. When I got there, I found her standing in the corner, her face pale, pointing at the large mirror that hung on the wall opposite the bed. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling. I approached the mirror, confused, and looked closely. At first, I didn't understand what she meant. It was just a regular mirror, or so I thought. Then as I moved my hand across the surface, something clicked. The glass wasn't reflecting right. It was too clear, too flat. I leaned in closer, and that's when I realized what it was. It was a two-way mirror. My wife stepped closer and pointed to the side of the mirror, her finger shaking. "I found a camera," she whispered. On the other side of the mirror, barely noticeable, was the faint outline of a hidden camera lens. Someone had been watching us the whole time. I felt sick. The thought of someone spying on us without our knowledge, invading our privacy like that, made my skin crawl. My wife's eyes were wide with fear, and I knew we needed to act fast. "We need to check the rest of the cabin," I said, my voice barely steady. We tore through the cabin, searching every room, every corner, every piece of furniture. In the bathroom, we found another hidden camera tucked behind a vent, pointed directly at the shower. My stomach turned. The idea that someone had been watching us in our most private moments filled me with dread. That's when my wife mentioned the locked room. From the moment we arrived, there had been one door in the cabin that we were not allowed to enter. The owner's rules said it was off limits, but now that we had found cameras, that locked room felt more ominous. "I saw something moving in there," my wife said, her voice shaky. "Under the door." My heart pounded as I knelt to look through the crack at the bottom of the door. For a second, I saw nothing but darkness. Then something shifted, a shadow, a slight movement. Someone was in there. Without saying another word, I grabbed my phone and called the police. My hands were shaking as I explained what we had found. The operator assured us that officers were on their way and told us to stay in a safe place until they arrived. We locked ourselves in the living room, every noise from the cabin sending a jolt of fear through my body. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an hour, until we finally heard the sound of sirens approaching. The police arrived quickly. 2 officers knocked on the door, and I let them in, explaining everything we had found. They listened carefully, their faces growing more serious as I told them about the two-way mirror, the cameras, and the locked room. One of the officers nodded, then motioned for us to stay back as they approached the locked door. They knocked first, calling out to whoever was inside, but there was no response. After a few moments, they forced the door open. Inside the room, hunched over a desk, was the owner of the cabin. He didn't even seem surprised when the police entered. On the desk in front of him was a laptop, and on the screen, we could see live feeds from the hidden cameras scattered throughout the cabin. He had been watching us the entire time. He said nothing as they led him out of the cabin in handcuffs, his face expressionless, as though this was just another day for him. As soon as he was gone, one of the officers turned to us. "You did the right thing calling us," he said. "We'll make sure he's charged for this." But his words did little to comfort me. The damage was already done. The thought that we had been watched, that our privacy had been violated so deeply, was something I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mirror, that camera, that locked door. We packed our things and left the cabin that same night. Neither of us could bear to stay there any longer, not even for a few more hours. As we drove away, the city lights flickering in the distance, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. The next morning, we checked into a hotel, but I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow made my heart race. Even now, weeks later, I still feel uneasy, like someone's watching me, just out of sight. I'll never stay in an Airbnb again. The experience left a mark on both of us, one that won't fade anytime soon. The world is full of hidden dangers, and sometimes they're lurking just behind the mirror. My grandma lived on a quiet, isolated road in North Carolina. Her house was small, old, and creaky, but it always felt like home. Every summer, my mom, my younger brother Sam, and I would visit her for a week or two. This year was no different. We were excited to spend time with her, eat home-cooked meals, and enjoy the peace of the countryside. Sam was 18, and I was a few years older. We both loved visiting Grandma, though Sam mostly liked the freedom of running around in the woods, and I enjoyed the slower pace of things. Mom was happy to see Grandma and relax for a bit. Our days were simple. We'd wake up early, eat breakfast, and then just do whatever we felt like, reading, hiking, or helping Grandma with her garden. One morning, after a peaceful night, we were sitting around the table, eating a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. The sun was shining, and the birds outside were chirping. It was just a typical day in the country. We had no idea how quickly things were about to change. As we ate, we suddenly heard the deep rumble of an engine outside. It wasn't the kind of sound you expected on Grandma's road. Hardly anyone ever drove down that road except for the mailman or the occasional farmer. Mom stood up and went to the window, her face showing a bit of concern. "There's a truck outside," she said, "but no one's in it." Sam and I exchanged confused looks. The truck was still running, just sitting there right in front of Grandma's house. That wasn't normal, not at all. Maybe someone got out and went into the woods. I suggested, though, it didn't feel like the right answer. We waited, staring at the truck. The engine kept running, but no one got out. It sat there, the hum of the engine filling the silence of the morning. Something about it made me uneasy. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a loud bang on the front door. The kind of bang that makes your heart jump into your throat. Sam, being curious and a little braver than me, stood up and walked to the door. He looked through the peephole, but then turned back to us with wide eyes. "There's no one out there," he whispered. Another bang followed, louder this time, shaking the door in its frame. We all froze for a moment. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Grandma was still sitting at the table, her face calm, but her hands trembling slightly. Suddenly, a knock came from the window. Not the front door this time, but the window right next to where we were sitting. Slowly, I turned my head, and there, standing just outside, was a tall man. His face was shadowed under a worn-out baseball cap, and his clothes were dirty like he'd been walking through mud. His eyes, though, were sharp and cold. "My truck broke down," he said in a slow, gravelly voice. "Mind if I come in and use the phone?" Mom stood up, moving toward the window. "Your truck's running just fine," she said, her voice firm but nervous. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer to the window, his face pressing against the glass. His expression was unsettling. His eyes locked on Sam. "Any young men in there who can help me out?" he asked, his tone shifting. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't a question. It felt more like a demand. "We don't have a phone," Mom lied, trying to keep him calm. But his eyes stayed fixed on Sam, and it was clear he wasn't going to just leave. The air felt thick, heavy with dread. Then he started banging on the window, harder this time. "Just open the door," he said, his voice getting louder. "I need someone to help me out here." We all stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Sam, though, had had enough. He wasn't the type to let someone threaten his family. He stepped away from the window, disappearing down the hall for a moment. When he came back, he was holding Grandma's old shotgun, the one she kept in the closet for emergencies. "Go away," Sam yelled, holding the shotgun up. The man didn't seem to care. He kept knocking, now banging harder, more aggressively. Without a word, Sam swung open the door just enough to fire a shot into the air, near the man's truck. The bang of the gun echoed through the quiet morning. The man froze for a second, his eyes widening with surprise. Then, without saying anything else, he backed away from the window, his face still cold and expressionless. He turned, walked to his truck, and got in. We watched as the truck pulled away, the engine roaring as it sped down the dirt road. Sam shut the door, locking it behind him, and we all stood there in silence, the shock of what had just happened sinking in. Mom called the police right away, explaining everything. When they arrived, they searched the area but found no sign of the man or his truck. It was as if he had just vanished. No one had seen a truck matching the description, and no one else in the area had reported anything strange. The police said they'd keep an eye out, but we knew deep down that they wouldn't find him. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. In May 2020, I went on a cruise with my mom and some extended family. It was meant to be a fun getaway after months of lockdown and isolation. The air felt fresh, and the sea stretched endlessly, giving me a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in a long time. The cruise ship was massive, with everything from swimming pools to theaters and restaurants. It was supposed to be a relaxing time, just unwinding and enjoying the warm sun. But things took a strange and unsettling turn from the very first morning. It was around 8 a.m. when we all headed to breakfast. The dining area was buffet style, with tables spread across a large room with massive windows that let in the sunlight, giving a beautiful view of the ocean. My mom and the others were chatting away, still waking up, but already excited about the day ahead. I, on the other hand, was more focused on filling my plate with the scrambled eggs and pancakes laid out in front of me. After piling up my food, I walked over to an empty table near one of the large windows. I liked the view, and I thought I'd enjoy my breakfast while watching the waves. The rest of my family was still in line, getting their food, so I sat alone for a moment. The hum of people talking, the clinking of plates, and the soft music playing over the speakers made it all feel peaceful. Then a man came and sat down at a table directly across from me. At first, I didn't think much of it. The dining area was crowded, and people were sitting wherever they could find a spot. But something about him felt off. He wasn't eating. He didn't even have a plate. He just sat there, staring at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, almost too focused. It was as if he was studying me, like I was some sort of strange creature he couldn't figure out. I tried to ignore him at first, thinking maybe he was just lost in thought or something, but then he smiled, not a friendly smile. I looked away, hoping that if I just ignored him, he would leave. My heart started to race, though I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But when I glanced back, he was still staring, still smiling. The rest of my family finally sat down at our table. My mom was talking to my aunt about what they wanted to do that day, and I tried to focus on their conversation, on my food, on anything but that man. But I could feel his eyes on me, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. After a while, I couldn't stand it anymore. I glanced up again, and he was gone. His chair was empty, as if he had never been there at all. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach didn't go away. I wanted to mention it to my mom, to tell someone about the strange man, but I didn't want to sound ridiculous. After all, people stare sometimes, right? Maybe I was just overthinking it. The day went by without any other incidents. We lounged by the pool, went to a show, and enjoyed the ship's amenities. By the evening, I had almost forgotten about the man from breakfast. But later, as we were walking back to our cabin after dinner, I spotted him again. He was a few feet behind us, walking at a slow pace. He wasn't trying to hide the fact that he was following us. He didn't even look away when I caught him staring. That same eerie smile was plastered on his face, like he knew something I didn't. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to alarm my mom or the others. Maybe he was just some weird guy, and it wasn't anything to worry about. Maybe. We reached our cabin and I quickly stepped inside, closing the door behind us. I leaned against it for a moment, listening, half expecting to hear footsteps stop right outside. But everything was quiet. Too quiet. For the rest of the trip, I kept seeing him. He would be at the edge of the crowd, standing near the pool, or sitting in the corner of the lounge. Always watching, always smiling. I tried to act like it didn't bother me, like he wasn't getting under my skin. But the truth was, I felt like I couldn't escape his eyes. Everywhere I went, there he was, lurking in the background, making my skin crawl. Then, On the last day of the cruise, just as we were getting ready to disembark, I saw him again. This time, though, he didn't just stand at a distance. He walked right up to me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt frozen, unable to move. He leaned in, so close that I could feel his breath on my ear. "You're lucky I changed my mind," he whispered. "You're safe now." I stood there stunned, too shocked to speak, as he straightened up and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. His words echoed in my head, sending a wave of nausea through me. What did he mean? What had he planned to do? I never saw him again after that. When we finally got off the ship, I felt a huge sense of relief, but his words haunted me long after the trip was over. To this day, I wonder what he had in mind. What could have happened if he hadn't changed his mind? And why me? I'll never know for sure, but every time I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that I have come far too close to something terrible. Something I was never supposed to understand. I've been a night nurse in the ICU for 7 years now, and it never gets less weird. I've seen things that would make most people quit on the spot. You'd think the constant sound of alarms and the sight of gross liquids spilling everywhere would be enough to creep me out. And don't even get me started on the patients. People die here, right in front of us, and we're the ones who have to handle it. One night, something happened that I'll never forget, and honestly, I wish I could. It was around 2 a.m., the dead of night, when the whole world outside the hospital seemed to fall asleep. But in the ICU, the machines keep beeping, patients keep moaning, and the fluorescent lights flicker just enough to make you wonder if you're imagining things. I was on my usual round, checking vitals and restocking supplies, when I glanced down the main hallway leading to the entrance. That's when I saw her. A little girl, no more than a year old, was standing right in front of the ICU entrance door. She was wearing a faded pink onesie with little ducks on it. Her hair was thin and wispy, barely growing in. She didn't make a sound, didn't cry or fuss, just stood there staring straight ahead with her big, dark eyes. I froze staring back. My brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Why is there a baby in the ICU? No adults were around, no nurses rushing after her, nothing. Just this tiny, silent child standing there like she had just wandered in on her own. We don't allow kids in the ICU. It's too dangerous. The infections we deal with here can spread fast, and a child's immune system can't handle it. So naturally, I started walking toward her, thinking maybe her parents were just around the corner. Maybe someone had made a mistake and brought her in, and I could get her out before anyone else noticed. But as I got closer, something didn't feel right. The air felt heavy, like the atmosphere had thickened all of a sudden. The overhead lights buzzed, flickering even more now. I could hear my footsteps echoing down the hall, too loud, like everything had gone silent around me, except for those damn footsteps. I picked up my pace, but when I reached the entrance, the girl was gone. Just gone. I looked left, then right, up and down the hall, but there was no sign of her. No adults, no stroller, no nothing. It was like the ICU had swallowed her whole. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt stupid, but also a little scared. Babies don't just disappear like that. Maybe she'd crawled into one of the rooms. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know I saw her. I know she was real. I turned around, ready to go back and ask one of my colleagues if they'd seen her too when I heard it. The softest sound, barely a whisper, like someone giggling. A baby's giggle. I spun around again, my eyes darting down the empty hallway. There was nothing, just the same lifeless corridor, stretching out before me. That's when one of the other nurses, Susan, came walking toward me. She looked tired, her hair messy from hours of work, but the moment she saw my face, she stopped. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice low. Did you see a kid?" I stammered. "Like a little girl. She was just here." Susan frowned, then shook her head slowly. She was wearing a pink onesie. I was gonna get her out, but when I got here, she was gone. Susan stared at me for a second. You believe me?" She nodded, crossing her arms. "Yeah, you're not the first one to see her, and you won't be the last." That stopped me cold. My mouth went dry and I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Susan glanced around, then motioned for me to follow her. We walked a little further down the hall, out of earshot from the patients, before she spoke again. "People have been seeing that baby for years," she said quietly. "It's always the same. A little girl in a pink onesie standing near the entrance. She never says anything, just stands there, then vanishes. The first time I saw her, I thought I was losing my mind. I didn't know what to say. I had so many questions, but none of them made sense in my head. Who is she? Did someone lose a kid here? Susan shrugged. No one knows, but the rumor is years ago a baby came through the ER and didn't make it. Sepsis or something like that. The parents never got to say goodbye. Ever since then, nurses, doctors, even some patients have reported seeing her. And no one does anything about it? Susan shook her head, looking grim. What can we do? There's no kid here, at least not one we can help. I don't know if it's a ghost or just our minds playing tricks, but after a while, you learn to ignore it. It's creepy, yeah, but it's the least of our problems around here. I didn't know what to think. I wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, maybe the lack of sleep catching up with me. After that night, I kept my head down, focused on my work, and tried not to think about it. But every time I passed that hallway, I couldn't help but glance over at the entrance, half expecting to see those dark eyes staring back at me. My name is Henry, and I will never forget the day I met Peter. It was one of those experiences that made you question the world around you, leaving you with a cold feeling deep inside, long after it's over. It all happened during my return trip to the United States from Norway. I had spent a few weeks there for work and was eager to get back home. What should have been a peaceful journey quickly turned into something much darker. I was sitting in the airport, minding my own business as I waited for my flight. I glanced around, seeing the usual sights you'd expect. People walking briskly, announcements echoing over the intercom, and the distant hum of conversations. It was just like any other airport, and at first, I had no reason to feel anything but calm. But that would soon change. While I scrolled through my phone to pass the time, a man around 30 years old sat down next to me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Airports are busy, and it's not unusual for strangers to sit nearby. He was dressed neatly in a black jacket, jeans, and well-worn sneakers. He had short, dark hair and a thin beard that gave him a casual but somehow sharp look. He introduced himself as Peter, a name that would soon burn itself into my memory. Peter smiled in a way that seemed friendly, but there was something behind it, something unsettling. He started with small talk, asking me where I was headed and what I had been doing in Norway. I answered politely, just like I would with any stranger. He mentioned he was traveling to the US as well, though he didn't say why. His questions seemed harmless enough at first, but soon they started getting personal, too personal. He asked me about my job, where I lived, and even how much money I made. I laughed nervously, trying to brush off his curiosity, but he kept pressing. He had a strange intensity about him, like he was digging for something. When he asked if I was rich, I felt my stomach tighten. Why would a stranger need to know that? I didn't answer directly, just said I made enough to get by, hoping he would lose interest. But Peter's questions didn't stop. He asked about my family, whether I traveled alone, and if anyone was waiting for me back home. Each question felt like another layer of a trap closing in around me. I started to feel uneasy, my heart pounding a little harder with every word he spoke. His eyes locked onto mine in a way that made it hard to look away, even though I wanted to. Eventually, the boarding call for our flight rang out, and I was relieved to get up and leave the conversation behind. I thought that was the end of it, but as luck would have it, Peter's seat on the plane was not far from mine. The flight itself was peaceful, almost too peaceful, after the strange encounter. I kept thinking about Peter's questions, the way he seemed to pry into my life, as if searching for something specific. I tried to shake the feeling off and closed my eyes, hoping to sleep through the rest of the flight. When we landed, I gathered my belongings and hurried off the plane, eager to leave Peter and his uncomfortable questions behind. I walked quickly through the terminal, hoping to blend in with the crowd, but just when I thought I had escaped him, I felt a presence behind me. I turned and there he was, Peter, grinning like he had a secret. "Hey, Henry," he called out casually like we were old friends. My skin prickled at the sound of his voice. He walked up to me and held something out. It was a small, valuable-looking piece of jewelry, a gold watch, intricately designed and worth a lot of money. He smiled wider, but this time there was no warmth in his eyes. "I took this from a guy on the plane," he said, his voice low and almost playful. "He didn't even notice. My heart dropped. I stared at the watch, realizing that Peter wasn't just a creepy guy asking personal questions. He was a thief, maybe worse. My pulse quickened as his words sank in. He had just admitted to stealing something, and now he was showing it off like it was some sort of joke. "Don't tell anyone," he warned, his smile fading. His voice turned cold, almost threatening, "or you'll be the next one." I froze. My mind raced, trying to process what he had just said. The weight of his words settled heavily in the air between us. He was warning me, making sure I knew what would happen if I crossed him. The playful tone from before was gone, replaced by something darker, something dangerous. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My mouth was dry, and all I could think about was getting away from this man as quickly as possible. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching as I disappeared into the crowd. For the rest of my journey home, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Peter's face and heard his voice warning me not to tell anyone. I never saw him again after that day, and I consider myself lucky. I don't know what Peter was truly capable of, but I knew enough to take his threat seriously. It was July 2019, and I was only 9 years old. I still remember that day like it just happened yesterday. The sun was shining brightly outside, casting long, lazy shadows through the curtains of our living room. I was sitting on the floor, playing with my toy cars. Everything seemed normal until my mom's phone rang. I could hear her voice from the kitchen, talking quietly, but something felt different this time. Her tone wasn't the usual cheerful one she used when she spoke to her friends. After a few minutes, she came into the living room, her face pale. "Honey," she said, kneeling in front of me, "your dad's had an accident. He's in the hospital, and I need to go see him." I felt a lump in my throat, but I trusted Mom. She told me it wasn't too serious, but she had to go right away. Since I was too young to go with her, she decided to leave me with our neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, an old woman who lived next door. I didn't know her well, but Mom said she was very nice and would take care of me. Mrs. Jenkins greeted us with a warm smile when we knocked on her door. She was an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, with silver hair tied into a bun and glasses that always seemed to slide down her nose. She wore long dresses, the kind you'd see in old movies. Her house smelled of freshly baked cookies and cinnamon. Come in," she said with a soft voice, ushering us inside. The house was cozy but a bit old-fashioned. Everything seemed to have a place, like nothing had moved in years. "Don't worry, dear. He'll be safe with me," she reassured my mom as she left. After Mom was gone, Mrs. Jenkins offered me some cookies and candies, which I gladly took. I sat in her living room, nibbling on the treats. The TV was on, showing some black and white movie I didn't recognize. The house was so quiet, and the only noise was the ticking of an old clock on the wall. As I sat there, I couldn't help but notice a door just across the living room. It was slightly ajar, and now and then, Mrs. Jenkins would disappear into that room, staying in there for a few minutes before coming back out. She didn't say anything about it, and I didn't ask at first. But it struck me as strange because, as far as I knew, Mrs. Jenkins lived alone. Curiosity started to creep into my mind. Why was she going in there so often? And what was in that room? My imagination began to run wild. Maybe she had a secret pet, like a cat or a bird, but I never heard any sounds. No meowing, no chirping. Silent. Eventually, I couldn't hold back my curiosity anymore. "Mrs. Jenkins," I asked, trying to sound casual, "is there someone in that room?" Her face changed instantly. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard look. She stopped what she was doing and stared at me, her expression turning almost angry. "There's no one in there," she said firmly, her voice low. "You stay out of that room." I didn't ask any more questions. Mrs. Jenkins went back to baking or whatever she was doing, but now the atmosphere felt different, darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later, Mrs. Jenkins told me she needed to go to the market to buy something. "Don't move and don't touch anything," she warned before leaving. The moment she closed the door behind her, my heart started to race. I was alone now, and that door, the one she kept going in and out of, was just a few feet away. I stood up, my legs shaky, and slowly made my way toward the door. I wasn't thinking anymore. I just needed to know what was inside. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I turned it, and the door creaked open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim light. At first, it seemed empty, but then I saw it, a figure lying on the bed, tightly bound with ropes. My breath caught in my throat. It was a boy, probably around 15 years old. His arms and legs were tied to the bedposts, and there was a cloth over his mouth. His eyes were wide with fear, pleading for help. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Who was he? Why was he tied up? Panic surged through me. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran out of the house as fast as I could. I grabbed my mom's phone from my pocket and dialed her number, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When she answered, I could barely get the words out. "Mom, there's a boy, tied up in Mrs. Jenkins' house." I heard her gasp on the other end. "Stay outside. I'm calling the police right now." I stood there trembling, waiting for my mom to arrive. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before the police showed up. They rushed into the house, and moments later, they came out with the boy. He looked pale and scared, but he was safe now. I found out later that the boy had been missing for a few weeks. The police had been searching for him, but no one had thought to check Mrs. Jenkins' house. She was arrested that day, but no one ever really found out why she had done it. She didn't have any family or history of strange behavior. The whole thing just didn't make sense. A few years ago, I stayed at a small old motel while driving through a quiet town. It wasn't a place I planned to stay for long, just one night to rest before continuing my trip the next day. The motel sat on the side of a lonely highway, with only a couple of cars in the parking lot. The building looked worn down, with peeling paint and dim lights flickering outside. I walked into the lobby, where an older man sat behind the desk. His tired eyes glanced up at me as I asked for a room. He handed me a key without saying much, but before I turned to leave, he paused. "Room 13, he said slowly. "Some say it's haunted. If anything strange happens, just ignore it." His words caught me off guard, but I didn't take them seriously. I laughed it off and thanked him, thinking it was just an old motel story to spook travelers. I found room 13 at the far end of the building, away from the few other occupied rooms. The key slipped into the lock with a soft click, and I pushed open the door. The room was small and simple: a bed, a table with a single chair, and a small TV sitting on a dresser. The wallpaper was faded, and the air felt thick, like the room hadn't been aired out in a while. It had an old, musty smell that reminded me of basements. I set my bag on the bed and took a look around. There wasn't much to see. A small window faced the back of the motel, where trees stood tall and shadows stretched across the ground. The bathroom was tiny, with cracked tiles and a rusty sink. Everything seemed normal, just old and worn out, but nothing unusual. Still, the room had a strange, heavy feeling that I couldn't shake. I tried to relax, but something about the room made me uneasy. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the silence, too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I turned on the TV for some noise, flipping through channels. Nothing good was on, but I left it running in the background to break the eerie quiet. As the night grew darker, I started feeling more tired. I turned off the TV and climbed into bed, pulling the thin, scratchy blanket over me. The mattress creaked under my weight, and I settled in, trying to fall asleep. But as I lay there, I felt like I wasn't alone. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a soft knock. It was faint, almost like it came from inside the room, not outside. I sat up, scanning the room, but there was nothing. I figured it must be the pipes or something settling in the old building, so I ignored it and tried to fall asleep again. Minutes passed, and then I heard it again, this time louder. It came from the corner of the room, where the small chair sat by the table. My heart began to beat faster. I told myself it was just the building making noise, but something didn't feel right. I stared at the chair for a long moment, waiting for something to happen. The room felt colder now, and my body tensed. Suddenly, the chair moved. It wasn't much, just a small shift, like someone had nudged it, but it was enough to make me jump out of bed. I stood there, staring at the chair, feeling my heart race. I wanted to leave, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. I walked over to the chair, slowly, and reached out to touch it. It was still, nothing happened. I breathed a little easier and went back to bed, convincing myself that it was nothing. But just as I lay down again, the TV turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, crackling loudly in the room. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing. I hadn't touched the remote. My hand was nowhere near it. That was enough for me. I grabbed my bag and bolted out of the room. I didn't even bother going back to the lobby. I tossed the key onto the front desk and ran to my car, speeding away from the motel without looking back. I worked the overnight shift at a drug rehabilitation center in London, just off the main road where the buses still ran late into the night. I had been on the job for about a month, settling into the routine of keeping an eye on the clients during the quiet hours. My shifts were uneventful for the most part, just rounds every hour, making sure everyone was asleep or at least in their rooms. Most of the time, nothing ever happened. But then there was room 307. When I started, the previous overnight staff mentioned that strange things happened in room 307. I didn't take it seriously at first. They told me stories about clients seeing shadows, hearing voices, or feeling something touch them in the middle of the night. One guy who worked before me swore he saw an apparition once, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, but it disappeared when he blinked. I thought it was all just stories to pass the time, to keep things interesting in a boring job. However, things started getting weird after about 3 weeks. There was one client, a guy named John, who always complained about feeling trapped in his bed. Every morning he'd say he had sleep paralysis during the night. He described waking up, unable to move, while something dark and heavy pressed down on his chest. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, wide-eyed and terrified, like he'd been fighting to breathe. The therapists brushed it off, saying it was probably his withdrawal symptoms playing tricks on him. Maybe it was, but that room had other issues. Every time I stepped into 307, it felt colder than the rest of the building. That's not an exaggeration. It didn't matter if the heater was cranked up to full blast. The moment I crossed the threshold into the room, I'd feel this sharp drop in temperature. I used to laugh it off, thinking maybe the insulation was poor, or the windows didn't close right, letting in cold air from outside. But no matter how many times I checked the windows, they were always sealed tight. One night in December, the heater was on full blast in the whole building. Everyone else's rooms were toasty warm, except 307. It was freezing in there, and it was the dead of winter. I shrugged it off again because I didn't want to let a little chill get to me. But the feeling stuck with me, like the cold had a life of its own in that room, seeping into your bones even when you left. That night, I was doing my usual rounds. It was around 2 a.m., the time when things were the quietest. Most of the clients were asleep, and the halls were completely still, except for the occasional hum of the heater. I started at one end of the building, walking from room to room, making sure everyone was in bed. When I reached 307, I paused. The door was slightly ajar, but that wasn't unusual. Some clients like to keep their doors cracked, just to feel less confined. I knocked gently, just to give a heads up before entering. But as I reached for the knob to push the door open, something strange happened. The doorknob started turning on its own. At first, I thought John was probably trying to open it from the inside. It wasn't uncommon for clients to get up late at night if they couldn't sleep. Some like to have a smoke or just talk for a bit to ease their minds. So I stepped aside, expecting to see John walk out. I waited for the door to swing open fully, but when it did, there was no one there. I stood there staring into the dark room. The bed was empty, the sheets were perfectly in place. No one had gotten up, and there wasn't a single sound coming from inside. I took a step into the room, feeling that cold hit me again like a wall. The room was as empty as it looked. The air felt heavy like it was pressing down on me, and the silence was almost too loud. I scanned the room, trying to figure out if I had just imagined the doorknob turning, but there was no one else there. No client hiding in the shadows, no one under the bed, nothing. I even walked over to the window, making sure it was closed. It was, of course. The night outside was quiet, and the streets were empty. I looked back at the bed. There was no way John could have opened the door and crawled back into bed without me seeing him. The layout of the room didn't allow for any hiding places. It was a straight shot from the door to the bed, and I had been standing right there when the door opened. I stood in the middle of that room for what felt like an eternity, just listening. My breath was coming out in little clouds like I was standing outside in the cold. The heater was still running in the hallway, but in 307, it didn't seem to make a difference. The cold in there wasn't natural, and the stillness didn't feel right. That was when I became a believer. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about room 307. I never told the clients about what I saw, but other staff members had their own stories. People said they felt watched, heard voices when no one else was around, and saw strange figures out of the corners of their eyes. I continued working the night shift for a few more months after that, but I always dreaded doing rounds past room 307. Something about that room lingered with me, like it had its energy, its presence. And while I couldn't explain what happened that night with the door, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that room didn't want to be disturbed. In 2018, I was 12 years old, and one weekend, my parents went out for the night, leaving me home alone. I had the house to myself, which I didn't mind too much. I spent most of the evening watching TV in the living room, snacking on chips and playing games on my phone. The house was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't usually like that, but when you're home alone, even the tiniest sounds seem louder than normal. The house we lived in wasn't very big, just a 2-story home with a basement that my parents used for storage. I didn't go down there often. It always felt a little strange, dark, cold, and musty. The light flickered sometimes, and it just made me uncomfortable. As the night grew later, the quietness felt heavier. I turned up the TV to drown it out, but something strange happened. The TV suddenly turned off. At first, I thought it was a power cut, but the lights were still on. Confused, I picked up the remote and tried turning it back on, but it wouldn't work. Then I heard a sound. It was faint, like a soft thumping noise, almost like someone was knocking on a door from far away. My heart started to beat faster. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling or maybe something outside, but the sound continued. It was coming from downstairs. I stood up slowly, feeling uneasy. The thumping grew louder, and now it sounded like it was coming from the basement. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my phone as a flashlight, I made my way toward the basement door. I opened the door and stood at the top of the staircase, shining my phone's light down into the darkness. The basement was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, just as I remembered it. The thumping had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was down there. Taking a deep breath, I walked down the stairs, my footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The basement smelled damp, and the air was colder than the rest of the house. I kept my eyes on the far corner, where a pile of old boxes was stacked. As I reached the bottom, I heard the sound again. This time it was closer, like it was right behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty basement. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt a chill run through the air. I wanted to leave, but something strange caught my attention. Near the corner of the room, there was a shadow. It looked like a man standing there, still and silent. I froze, staring at the shadow. It didn't move, but it felt like it was watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a tall man. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly backed away, my phone shaking in my hand. The shadow seemed to shift, and for a moment I thought I saw the outline of a face, pale and ghostly. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy. I stumbled backward and fell against the stairs, my phone slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. The shadow didn't move toward me, but I could feel its presence like it was waiting. Panic set in and I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my phone and rushing up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut behind me and locked it. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. For a long time, I just stood there, listening. The house was silent again, but the basement felt alive with something I couldn't explain. I didn't dare go back down there. I stayed in the living room, with all the lights on, waiting for my parents to come home. When they finally did, I didn't say anything about what happened. I didn't know if they would believe me, and I wasn't even sure if I believed it myself. Halloween night has always been my favorite. It's the one night when you can be someone or something else entirely. I've always loved the chill in the air, the sound of dry leaves crunching under my feet, and the flickering jack-o'-lanterns that cast eerie shadows on every doorstep. This year, my friends and I decided to take things slow. We weren't kids anymore, running house to house for candy, but we still liked to roam the neighborhood, soaking in the spooky vibe. It was just me, Tony, Rachel, and Kyle, walking down the streets lined with fake cobwebs, plastic skeletons, and paper bats hanging from trees. Kids dressed as witches, superheroes, and monsters ran around laughing and screaming. It was Halloween, and everything felt just right. That's when we saw her. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. She wore a pale, old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd see in black and white photos from the early 1900s. It looked out of place next to all the colorful superhero costumes and cartoon characters. Her dress was frilly and long, the hem brushing the tops of her shoes. She also carried a handmade candy bag, not the store-bought kind everyone else had. Her bag was a dull beige, stitched together with uneven threads. We didn't think much of it at first. She was just another kid, right? But as we kept walking through the neighborhood, we noticed something strange. She was always ahead of us. No matter which street we turned onto, we'd see her, just a few houses ahead, standing by a door with her bag outstretched, waiting for candy. The glow from the porch lights reflected off her pale dress, making her stand out even more. "She's fast," Tony muttered, watching her from a distance. "How does she keep getting ahead of us?" It wasn't like she was running. Every time we saw her, she was either standing still or walking slowly, like she had all the time in the world. It didn't make sense. We decided to follow her, not in a creepy way, just to see where she was going. But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't catch up. She'd turn a corner, and by the time we reached the same spot, she'd be at another house, holding out her bag again. It was like she was floating through the night, untouched by time. "Maybe she's with her parents, and they're just out of sight," Rachel suggested, trying to be logical about it. But there were no adults around, just the girl in the old dress. We kept walking, our eyes glued to her. The more we watched, the more uneasy I felt. The other kids didn't seem to notice her. They rushed past her like she wasn't even there, focused on filling their candy bags. Even the adults handing out candy seemed distant when she was at their door. They'd drop a piece into her bag and close the door without a word. No smiles, no small talk, just a quick transaction like they were in a hurry to get rid of her. "Do you think she's lost?" Kyle asked. His voice was low, like he didn't want an answer. "I don't know," I said, feeling a shiver run through me. Something's not right. The streets were starting to thin out. The families with little kids had gone home, and the older teenagers were at parties or hanging out somewhere else. But the girl in the old dress was still there, making her rounds. We turned onto a street that led to the edge of the neighborhood, where the houses grew farther apart. The girl was there, standing in front of a darkened house with no lights on. She held out her bag, but no one answered the door. After a long moment, she turned and started walking down the street again, her small figure barely visible in the dim glow of distant streetlights. "Let's just go home," Tony said, his voice uneasy. "This is getting weird." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. "I want to know who she is," I said, my curiosity stronger than my fear. We kept following her, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice us, if she even could notice us. I started to feel like we were chasing a shadow, something that didn't belong in this world. Eventually, she turned down a long road at the edge of town. It was a road no one used anymore, leading to a patch of woods. We stopped at the corner, watching her disappear into the darkness. "Are we going to follow her into the woods?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, though part of me wanted to. Before we could decide, a car pulled up beside us. It was an old man, someone from the neighborhood we'd seen a few times before. He rolled down his window, looking at us with tired, concerned eyes. "You kids shouldn't be out here," he said. "It's late and this road, well, it's not safe." "We saw a girl," I said, pointing down the road. "She went that way." The man's face went pale, his eyes widening. "A girl? Was she wearing an old dress?" "Yeah," Kyle said, his voice shaky. "Do you know her?" The old man sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "You won't find her," he said quietly. "That girl, she died years ago. Car accident on this road, Halloween night. They never found her body." but people say they see her sometimes, still trick-or-treating like she's trying to find her way home. We stood there in stunned silence, our hearts pounding in our chests. "You kids go on home now," the man said softly. "It's better if you leave her be." We didn't argue. We turned and walked back to the neighborhood, too scared to look over our shoulders. The girl in the old dress was gone, swallowed by the night, forever wandering, trick-or-treating. I never saw her again, but every Halloween I can't help but wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone to help her find her way home. This happened during my freshman year at Rutgers University in the spring 2022 semester. I was studying abroad in Rome, Italy. I had been looking forward to it for months, imagining I'd make lifelong friends and experience the magic of the city. But my time there turned out to be far from what I had expected. I didn't make any friends, and I didn't particularly enjoy my classes either. However, the real reason Rome left such a bitter taste in my mouth was because of an incident I was about to share. It was a typical Tuesday. My last class ended around 5:30 in the evening. The sun was starting to set, and I was tired from a long day of lectures. I caught the train back to my apartment like I did every other day. I remember standing there, zoning out, watching the scenery blur by the window as the train rumbled along. The first 3 stops went by without incident. People got on, people got off, and I barely paid attention. I was just eager to get back and relax. At the 4th stop, I stepped off the train, and everything changed in an instant. I hadn't taken more than a few steps when I saw a man coming toward me. He didn't look particularly threatening at first, just an ordinary guy in the crowd. But before I knew it, he was right in front of me, and then, out of nowhere, he punched me hard in the groin. I doubled over in shock and pain, barely able to process what had just happened. The next thing I knew, he reached into my pocket, snatched my wallet, and took off running. I was still hunched over, trying to catch my breath, but anger flared up inside me. I wasn't gonna let him just take my wallet like that. Without thinking, I pushed through the pain and ran after him. The station was crowded, but I could see him weaving through people, heading for the exit. Thankfully, he wasn't fast, and I was quickly gaining on him. I yelled at him to stop, but he didn't. Fueled by adrenaline, I sprinted harder, closing the gap between us. When I was right behind him, I tackled him to the ground. We hit the pavement hard. I didn't think twice. I just swung my fists, landing a few punches. My heart was racing, and I was angry. I grabbed my wallet back from his pocket and bolted from the scene before he could recover. The adrenaline carried me back to my apartment. When I finally slammed the door behind me, I felt my entire body relax. I was breathless, sweating, and still in shock from what had just happened. I gulped down a glass of water and slumped onto my bed. My body ached, but I figured the worst part was over. I lay down and took a nap, hoping to sleep off the stress. I woke up about 30 minutes later, feeling a bit better, and decided to make myself some dinner. As I sat down to eat, I was replaying the whole ordeal in my head, wondering if I'd done the right thing by chasing the guy. Maybe I should have let him go, but what's done was done, and I was just glad to have my wallet back. Just as I was finishing my meal, I heard loud, insistent banging on my door. It startled me, and then I heard someone shouting, "Police!" My heart sank. I had no idea why the police would be at my door. I opened it cautiously, and there stood 3 officers, looking serious. Without wasting any time, they told me I was being arrested for assault and sexual assault. I was stunned. I tried to explain that I had only chased down the guy who stole my wallet, but they weren't listening. They cuffed me, and I was taken to the police station in a daze. When I arrived at the station, I couldn't believe my eyes. The guy who had mugged me was standing there, and beside him was a woman I'd never seen before. The man pointed at me and told the police, "That's the guy who assaulted my sister." I chased him down, and when I caught him, he attacked me. I was speechless. It felt like the ground had been pulled from under me. I explained to the officers what had happened, that I was the one who'd been mugged, and that I had no idea who the woman was. But the officers weren't convinced. They asked the woman if the man's story was true, and to my utter disbelief, she said yes. I was in shock. I tried to keep calm, but my mind was racing. How could this be happening? I called my parents and told them everything. They were just as shocked as I was, and they promised to fly to Rome immediately to support me. In the meantime, I was placed in a holding cell to await my court date, which was set for 3 days later. Those 3 days felt like an eternity. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and could barely think straight. When the day of the trial finally came, my parents arrived just a few hours before the hearing. Seeing them gave me some comfort, but I was still terrified about what might happen. As I was led into the courtroom in handcuffs, I saw my mother crying in the front row. My heart ached. I couldn't believe this was happening to me. As I sat down at the defendant's table, I noticed someone familiar on the witness stand. It was a man who had been on the same train the night I was mugged. The trial began, and the woman stuck to her story, claiming that I had followed her home, forced my way inside, and assaulted her. She said her brother had caught me and that I had attacked him when he tried to stop me. It was horrifying to hear her lie so confidently. When it was my turn to speak, I told the court exactly what had happened. I was terrified that no one would believe me. But then the witness spoke. He told the judge that he had seen the whole thing, that I had been mugged on the train, and that I had chased the thief to get my wallet back. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as he told the truth. After what felt like hours of deliberation, the judge finally made his decision. I was found not guilty. I nearly collapsed with relief. My parents and I hugged tightly outside the courtroom, all of us in tears. Though the brothers and sisters never went to jail for their false accusations, they were fined heavily for their lies. It was a small consolation, but I was just grateful to be free and not trapped in an Italian prison. I haven't been back to Rome since, and I don't plan on ever returning. Now, as a senior, I want to share this story as a warning to anyone studying abroad. Be careful, stay aware of your surroundings, and if someone mugs you, don't chase them. You never know how things might escalate, and it could end up far worse than what happened to me. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. In the early 1990s, I worked as a waitress at a small restaurant while I was studying for my associate degree in business. It wasn't the most exciting job and the pay was low, only $7.25 an hour. But it was enough to get by, and I made a few friends. Still, there was one night during my time there that would stay with me forever, a night I've never been able to shake from my memory. It was an ordinary evening, like any other. The restaurant was filled with the usual mix of families, couples, and regulars, and I went about my routine like I always did. But then something happened that I couldn't have predicted. A family walked in, a man and a woman who looked unkempt, and with them was a teenage girl. There was something about them that caught my eye, something I couldn't put my finger on. They seemed out of place, as if they didn't quite belong there, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. I seated them at a table, handed them menus, and went on my way. After a few minutes, I saw the girl drop her fork onto the floor. I went over to pick it up for her, a simple gesture. But when I handed it back, she grabbed my hand a little too firmly. It wasn't just a casual touch, it was intentional. Her grip felt strange, strong but also nervous. Still, I brushed it off. I had other tables to attend to, and the night was busy. A few minutes later, I passed by their table again, and once more, the girl dropped her fork. This time I was more aware and more alert. I bent down, picked it up, and when I gave it back to her, her hand squeezed mine again. It was even firmer this time, almost like she was trying to send a message. I started to feel uneasy, but I didn't know what to do. How could I be sure it meant anything? Maybe she was just nervous, I told myself. But the same thing happened 2 more times. Each time, the girl would drop her fork, and each time, she would grab my hand a little tighter when I returned it. By now, it was obvious that this wasn't just a coincidence. She was doing it on purpose. There was something she was trying to tell me, but I couldn't figure out what. I could feel a sense of urgency in her grip, but I was still unsure of what was going on. Eventually, the family finished their meal and left. I watched them go, still feeling that something was wrong, but not knowing what. Once they were gone, I went over to their table to clean up. As I started clearing the dishes, I noticed a napkin tucked under one of the plates. There was writing on it. "Help me! Call the police," the message read. My heart nearly stopped. I stared at the words, my mind racing. That girl had been trying to tell me something all along, and I had missed it. I had been too slow to understand, too unsure to act. The realization hit me like a wave of guilt and dread. That girl was in danger, and I hadn't done anything to help her. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I replayed the encounter over and over in my mind, trying to figure out what I could have done differently. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how familiar the girl had looked. There was something about her face, her eyes, that I couldn't forget. Then it hit me. I had seen that face before. The girl in the restaurant looked just like a missing person I had seen on the news, a girl named Antoinette Cayedito. She had been missing for years, taken from her home when she was only 9 years old. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the girl I had seen that night was Antoinette. It was a horrifying realization. I had been so close to her, and yet I hadn't done anything to help her. The guilt ate away at me. If I had only recognized her sooner, if I had acted when she dropped that first fork, maybe I could have saved her. Maybe I could have stopped whatever terrible thing was happening to her. I started looking into her case, trying to learn everything I could. Antoinette's mother, Penny, had always seemed suspicious to me. She didn't look like a grieving mother desperate to find her child. There was something off about her, something that made me wonder if she had been involved in her daughter's disappearance. Some people even suspected that Penny had sold Antoinette, that she had a hand in the tragedy that had torn their family apart. I don't know if that's true, but the thought of it sickens me. How could a mother do such a thing? How could anyone let something so horrible happen to their child? The more I thought about it, the more it all seemed too awful to be real. But the reality was right there, staring me in the face. I had seen Antoinette alive all those years after she went missing, and I had done nothing to help her. Antoinette has never been found. She's still listed as a missing person, but the truth is, no one knows if she's alive or dead. The case remains unsolved, and all I can do is hope that wherever she has found some kind of peace. That night still haunts me. I often think about the girl with the fork, the girl who squeezed my hand, trying to tell me something. When I was 14 years old, I was at a summer camp in the San Bernardino forest with a youth group. There were about 12 or so of us there, and 4 of my friends were the oldest and seen as being in charge of the younger girls. We would be there for a week, and the first 3 days were going great. But on the night of the 4th day, some of the younger girls came running and crying to us, saying that they saw something scary in the woods. They told us that they all saw a very tall, slender, extremely pale, bald, and humanoid-looking creature staring at them. At first, we wanted to brush it off as being their imagination, but when we saw how genuinely terrified they were and how they were sobbing, we started to get the feeling they may have been telling the truth. Most of them even requested that their tents were to be moved next to ours, as they felt more comfortable with us nearby. Even then, they were still crying and refused to sleep, so we had one of my friends go and sleep with them in their tent to help them feel better. Even though my friends and I hadn't seen anything, we were still scared shitless, which is why we decided that the 4 of us were going to all sleep in the same tent. I know it's a little childish, but we couldn't fall asleep being alone for the life of us. That same night, we heard very loud footsteps around our tent. This went on for about 10 minutes while we were just trying to ignore it. But then we heard an indescribable, choking, gurgling, laughing type of sound come from right on top of our tent. Mind you, the tent we were in was about 6 feet tall, and to make a sound on top of it like that, you'd have to also be bending over, which would make you about 7 feet tall, give or take. Just didn't seem probable for it to be someone pranking us or something. Another thing to add is that all other nature noises seemed to just stop during all of this. The 3 previous nights we had loudly heard the chirp of crickets, the hoots of owls, and even a running stream near our campsite. But somehow during this night, as well as all nights following, all of these noises had just stopped. Even the stream we couldn't hear at night, but could then magically hear as soon as morning struck. The next day we briefly talked about it, but didn't want to because we were so terrified. As soon as it started to get dark out, I got this pit in my stomach and just hoped and wished that nothing weird would happen tonight. Before bed, I went to the outhouse and had my friend wait for me outside. I could have sworn I heard breathing at the mesh window, but was way too scared to look. As soon as I got out, my friend mentioned to me that she heard footsteps and the crunching of leaves around the outhouse building. When we eventually all got to bed, we decided to sleep in the same tent again, but luckily nothing out of the ordinary happened, other than one of my friends mentioning that she heard a loud, inhuman screech come from near our tent around 2 to 3 a.m. Of course, though I can't truly verify that happened, I wouldn't doubt it. The sixth night, which was also the last, was the worst by far. Two of my friends decided to go back and sleep in their tent, but I still didn't feel comfortable doing so because I was the only one who was tenting by myself. All went well that night, until about 12 or 1 a.m. when I woke up crouched down, hovering over and staring at my friend's face. Mind you, I have never sleepwalked in my life, and there's zero history of it in my family. After I woke up, I was confused and weirded out, but had no time for that because I heard loud footsteps and a low growling sound circling our tent. I was so paralyzed in fear that I didn't move and just stood there for a good 5 minutes until I decided to just go for it and jump down under my sleeping bag. I covered my ears so I couldn't hear it anymore, and I forced myself to sleep. Later that night, the friend that I was crouched over earlier woke up and noticed that I wasn't sleeping next to her anymore and that our tent door was open. She figured that I had just gone to the bathroom and didn't think much of it. One of my other friends sleeping in the other tent also told me that she remembered hearing our tent unzip and hearing strange noises that she couldn't quite pick up. I have no recollection of this ever happening, and I woke up in the morning in my sleeping bag as usual, but our tent door was slightly open, which I undoubtedly remembered leaving completely closed. That morning, we talked to the staff of the camp about what had happened throughout the week, and they seemed frightened, saying that they've had similar occurrences happen in the past, but refused to give us any more information. We also talked to the group at the campsite next to us, and guess what? They had also experienced similar things and saw something in the woods that perfectly resembled what we saw. One more thing to add on, which I'm not even sure is related to this or not, but ever since I got home from camp, I've heard knocks, taps, scratching on my door and walls, and whispering of my name in my room, which I had never heard before going to camp. But again, I'm still unsure of if these two events are related. I still get freaked out when I wonder what happened when I was outside my tent, possibly with that thing. And yes, I'm gonna call it a thing, because there is no way in hell it was a person or any kind of animal. I've worked in a gun shop for around 15 years. It's not the life I had imagined for myself when I was younger, but it pays the bills, and I've grown comfortable with the routine. Most days are quiet, with people coming in asking about hunting gear, guns, or repairs. Now and then, we get a strange customer, but nothing too out of the ordinary. Or so I thought. It was sometime in 2016, just an average day. I was at the counter, organizing some paperwork when the phone rang. As usual, I picked it up, said the shop's name, and introduced myself. On the other end, a man's voice asked, "Do you sell hunting supplies?" Nothing weird about that. We get calls like that all the time. I answered, "Yes, we do. What can I help you with?" The man didn't hesitate. "I need thermal clips," he said, with a tone that was both serious and impatient. The words caught me off guard. I had never heard of thermal clips in all my years at the shop. It didn't sound like anything related to guns or hunting. Confused, I asked, "Who is this?" Without missing a beat, the man replied, "Commander Shepard." The name sounded like something out of a video game or a movie. Still, he kept going, repeating, "I need thermal clips." I started to realize this guy wasn't serious. We didn't sell anything like thermal clips, whatever they were, and it felt like he was just wasting my time. I didn't have the patience for it, so I hung up. As I put the phone down, I figured that would be the end of it. Some guy with too much time on his hands, playing a prank. Just to be sure, I called a friend of mine who worked as a police officer. I told him about the strange call and the guy claiming to be Commander Shepard. My friend listened and then told me something that surprised me. This wasn't the first time someone had called gun shops in the San Francisco area asking for thermal clips. Other shops had reported similar calls. It seemed like this guy was making a habit of it. Hearing that made me a bit uneasy, but I figured there wasn't much to worry about. Probably just some prankster looking for a reaction. I thanked my friend and hung up the phone. Barely 5 minutes had passed when the phone rang again. I sighed, hoping it wasn't the same person, but when I picked up, there he was. "What the hell was that for?" the voice on the other end snapped. It was him again, Commander Shepard. I tried to stay calm, but my frustration was growing. I told him that I had traced the call and had reported it to a police officer. I warned him that harassment like this could get him in trouble. I hoped that would scare him off, but instead he just got angrier. "I don't care about your damn security," he spat, his voice sharp with anger. I hung up again, thinking that this time he'd get the message. But of course, the phone rang again. Now I was irritated. I didn't even bother speaking when I picked up. The voice on the other end was the same, but this time there was something different in his tone. "Maybe we can figure this out," he said, almost as if he was trying to negotiate. I stayed quiet, not sure what to expect. Then his voice changed. It became louder, more aggressive. "I'll cut your balls off and sell them," he threatened, the words hitting me like a punch. My stomach twisted, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. This had gone from a prank to something much darker, much more disturbing. I forced myself to respond, telling him that the call was being traced and that I was ready to press charges if he didn't stop. I could hear the beeping on the phone and the sound of the trace kicking in. He didn't seem to care. He screamed something about getting a lot of bullshit on the line, his voice growing more frantic with each word. I hung up for the last time. My hands were shaking a little, but I tried to calm myself. He didn't call back after that, and for a while, the shop was quiet again. But the whole thing stayed with me, the weirdness of it all, the way his voice had changed from calm to threatening so quickly. Even now, years later, I think about that call sometimes. I wonder who he was and what his deal was. Was he just some guy with too much time on his hands? Or was he dangerous? I never found out. All I know is that the phone didn't ring again that day, and for that, I'm grateful. Working in a gun shop, you expect to deal with strange people now and then, but this one was different. There was something off about him, something I still can't quite shake, even after all these years. Halloween night always had a way of feeling different. This year was no exception. My friend Alex was hosting a party at his old family house, a place already a bit spooky with its creaky floors and dim lights. The decorations were perfect. Cobwebs, pumpkins, and eerie lighting gave the place an unsettling atmosphere. But what set the tone for the night was one guest. The party started like any other. People arrived in creative costumes, vampires, witches, clowns, and even a zombie bride. Music played softly in the background, and the air was filled with laughter and chatter. I mingled, had some punch, and admired the creativity of everyone's outfits. Then I noticed him. He was standing in the corner, still as a statue. His costume was simple, too simple for a Halloween party. He wore an old suit, faded and wrinkled like something from a different time. But it was the mask that caught my eye. It didn't look like any mask I had ever seen. It was too real, too detailed, almost like someone's face had been taken off and worn like a disguise. At first, I thought it was a clever design. The face was pale, the lips thin, and the eyes dark. But the longer I looked, the more uneasy I felt. There was something wrong about it. The skin looked too textured, too alive. I found myself staring, waiting for him to move or blink, but he just stood there. People assumed he was someone we knew, probably just staying in character. But as the night went on, it became clear that something wasn't right. He didn't talk, didn't laugh, didn't even touch the food or drinks. He stayed in that same corner, watching. I pointed him out to Alex, who shrugged. "Probably someone messing around," he said, but his voice had a hint of unease. "I'll check later." But as the night went on, no one approached the masked guest. We all kept a distance, whispering about how strange it was, but too nervous to say anything. Hours passed, and the party began to wind down. Only a handful of us were left, mostly close friends. It was then that I noticed the masked man had moved. He was no longer in the corner. He was standing near the door, his head slightly tilted like he was listening to something. I felt a knot in my stomach. It was subtle, but there was a tension in the air now, like something was about to happen. Alex finally decided to approach him. "Hey man, nice costume, but the party's over. Who are you?" His voice was light, but I could tell he was uncomfortable. There was no response. The man didn't even acknowledge him. Alex tried again. This time, he reached out as if to pull the mask off. That's when everything changed. The moment his fingers touched the mask, Alex jerked his hand back like he had been burned. It's stuck!" he shouted, eyes wide with shock. "I can't take it off." A few of us rushed over. I grabbed the mask, expecting it to come off easily, but it didn't budge. The skin felt warm, too warm. Panic started to set in. The masked man wasn't struggling or fighting us, but he wasn't helping either. It was as if the mask was part of him, fused to his face. Then something worse happened. The masked man's hand moved. He lifted it slowly, placing it on Alex's arm and squeezed. Alex yelped and pulled away. The grip had been too strong, unnatural. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. No answer. The man's dark eyes just stared through the holes in the mask, empty and cold. It was then I realized, whoever was under that mask wasn't the person we thought. The others must have sensed it too, because we all stepped back, hearts pounding. Alex, now pale, glanced at me. "We need to get him out of here," he whispered. But as we debated what to do, the man turned and walked out the door, leaving without a word. The party was over. Everyone quickly packed up, the joy of the night long gone. But something about the whole thing kept gnawing at me. I needed answers. The next day, I did some digging. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen that mask somewhere before. I went to the local library, searching through old news clippings, looking for anything that might explain what happened. That's when I found it. Decades ago, in the very town we lived in, there had been a string of murders. The killer had worn a mask made from the skin of his victims. He vanished one Halloween night and was never found. The details were eerily similar to what we had experienced. The mask in the old black and white photo was the same one from the party. The face, the texture, the empty eyes, it all matched. I felt sick. I told Alex, and together we went to the police. They didn't believe us, of course. "Just a Halloween story," they said. But we knew what we saw. That mask wasn't just a costume. It was something far worse. A few days later, Alex started acting strange. He stopped answering his phone, skipped work, and wouldn't open the door when I visited. When I finally saw him, he looked different. His eyes were darker, his movements slower, more deliberate. And the worst part, he didn't speak. It was like he had become someone else, someone wearing a mask. I haven't seen him since. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that Halloween party, about the man who wore the mask. And I wonder, did the killer vanish all those years ago? Or did he just find someone new to wear? I've been a truck driver for most of my life. The long roads, the steady hum of the engine, and the isolation, they're all things I've grown used to. Driving at night is part of the job. There's something peaceful about it. The empty highways, the quiet, the moonlight illuminating the road ahead. But there's also a loneliness that creeps in, especially when you're hundreds of miles away from anything familiar. You start to notice things, every sound, every shadow, even the slightest flicker of movement from the corner of your eye. That's how it was the night I picked him up. It was a typical route, driving through the back roads of some small town on the way to my delivery spot. It was around midnight, and I had the radio on low, the static and occasional country song filling the cabin. I'd been driving for hours and the night was cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making you shiver even with the heater on. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something in the distance. A figure standing by the side of the road, arm raised in that unmistakable hitchhiker's pose. Now, I'm not one to pick up strangers, especially not at this hour. But something about this guy, maybe the desperation in the way he waved or the fact that it was freezing outside, made me slow down. I pulled up beside him, and he immediately approached my door. He looked normal enough, just a man in his late 30s, wearing a thick jacket and a beanie. His face was hidden in the shadows, but he smiled when he spoke. "Thanks for stopping, man," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "I've been out here for hours. My car broke down a few miles back." I hesitated, my instincts telling me to just drive off. "Think you can give me a lift?" Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in, and we set off down the highway. The truck's engine roared back to life, and the two of us sat in silence for a few minutes. I kept my eyes on the road, trying not to think too much about the fact that I had a stranger sitting next to me. "So, you're a truck driver, huh?" the man eventually said, breaking the quiet. His voice was calm, almost too calm for someone who had supposedly been stranded on the side of the road. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my answers short. "What are you hauling?" "Just some supplies," I said, not feeling the need to give him too much information. He nodded but didn't say anything else. I could feel him watching me, though. Every time I glanced out of the corner of my eye, I caught him staring. Something wasn't right, and the air in the cab felt heavy like a storm was coming. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead. After another 10 minutes of uncomfortable silence, the man shifted in his seat. "You know," he said slowly, "I could use some cash." I blinked, taken aback by the sudden request. "What?" I said I could use some cash. "You know, to get my car fixed or whatever," he repeated, his voice lower now, almost threatening. I shook my head. "I don't carry cash on me." The man's demeanor changed instantly. His calmness evaporated, replaced by something darker. He reached into his jacket, and before I could react, he pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the dim light from the dashboard. "I wasn't asking," he growled, his eyes narrowing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I tried to keep my voice steady, but fear was creeping in. "I told you, I don't have any cash," I repeated. The man leaned closer, the knife inches from my side. "Give me your wallet, your phone, anything," he snarled. "I don't care what you have, but you're gonna give it to me." I didn't have much time to think. I knew if I handed over anything, he wouldn't stop there. He'd want more, and I wasn't about to find out how far he was willing to go. My mind raced, searching for a way out. "I'm not giving you anything," I said, my voice firmer now, despite the terror gnawing at me. That's when he snapped. He lunged at me with the knife, and I barely managed to swerve the truck in time to avoid getting stabbed. The truck jerked violently, and I heard the sound of tires screeching as I fought to keep control. We were in the middle of nowhere, no lights, no other cars, just the two of us in the dark. The man slashed again, grazing my arm this time. Pain shot through me, but I didn't let go of the wheel. I pushed the accelerator harder, the truck barreling down the road at a dangerous speed. He tried to stab me again, but this time I was ready. In a split-second decision, I slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a stop, and the sudden jolt threw the man forward. His head hit the dashboard with a sickening thud, and he dropped the knife. I didn't wait. I threw open my door and jumped out, stumbling onto the road, clutching my bleeding arm. I don't remember how long I ran. The cold night air bit at my skin, and the pain in my arm throbbed with every step. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance, and I waved frantically. A passing car stopped, and the driver, a kind older woman, immediately called for help. The police arrived soon after. They found the man still unconscious in my truck. Turns out he had a record, mostly petty crimes, but he had escalated quickly. They took him into custody, and I was rushed to the hospital. I was lucky. The cut on my arm wasn't deep, and aside from some bruises, I was mostly shaken up. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. The roads I once found peaceful now felt dangerous. The solitude I once enjoyed now felt like a trap. When I started my first year at Troy University in Alabama, I had one goal in mind: to join the college marching band. It had been a dream of mine for as long as I could remember. I played the sousaphone, and this year I had the honor of being promoted to assistant section leader. Being part of the band meant everything to me: the music, the friendships, and the sense of belonging. But one terrible event almost made me walk away from it all. It was during band camp, a tough, week-long ordeal that always takes place during the first week of August. The heat was brutal, and the days were long, but I loved every second of it. I had already made a few friends, some of whom I knew from high school. Everything was going well, at least for the first 4 days. But the 5th day of band camp changed everything. It's a day I've tried hard to forget, but no matter what I do, the memory remains. That evening, after a long day of rehearsals, we were scheduled for a night session. I had just finished dinner and was heading back to the locker room to get my instrument. With about 25 minutes to spare before practice, I decided to stop by the bathroom. I wasn't in a rush, just going through my usual routine. I walked into the bathroom, feeling tired but ready for the night ahead. The stalls were all empty, and I picked one at random. I closed the door behind me and was about to sit down when something strange caught my eye. I froze, staring in disbelief. From the corner of my vision, I saw someone moving on the floor, crawling. It didn't register immediately, but as I focused, I realized it was a man. A man I recognized from the marching band. He was in the drumline, part of the cymbal section, though I didn't know his name at the time. His face was twisted in a sick grin, his eyes gleaming with something dark and dangerous. Before I could react, he slid under the stall divider. I was trapped. Panic surged through me, and my body locked up in fear. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. He grabbed me, his hands rough and forceful, pinning me down with strength I couldn't fight against. I was shaking, my mind racing in terror as he pulled at my clothes. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt powerless, crushed under the weight of this nightmare. But then, from somewhere outside the stall, I heard the bathroom door fly open. There were hurried footsteps, fast and determined. At that moment, hope flickered in my chest. Someone was coming. Someone had heard me. The stall door shook violently as whoever it was kicked at it, trying to break it open. After 3 hard kicks, the door finally swung open, revealing one of the graduate assistants from the band. She didn't hesitate. She took one look at the situation, and the fury in her eyes was undeniable. Without missing a beat, she screamed at the man, "Get out of here! Right now, before I call the police! Don't ever come back!" He didn't wait. The fear on his face was almost satisfying, but I was still too shaken to take much comfort in it. He scrambled to his feet and bolted from the bathroom. As soon as he was gone, the GA turned to me. Her voice softened as she asked if I was okay, but all I could do was shake my head. The terror still clung to me like a heavy weight, but I was grateful that she had shown up when she did. Without her, I don't know what would have happened. I have always loved my work. As a graphic designer, I get to create things every day. My office is small and quiet, perfect for focusing on my projects. I usually spend most of my day working on designs for clients, making sure every detail is perfect. I take pride in what I do, and even though it can be exhausting, I always feel satisfied when the day ends. But something changed in me after what happened one night when I came home from work. It was a night that would stay with me forever. It was a Friday evening, and I was ready for the weekend. I left the office around 7 p.m., later than usual, but that wasn't uncommon. The sun had just set, leaving the sky a mix of orange and purple. As I drove home, I thought about how I would spend the weekend relaxing. Maybe I'd watch a few movies, order takeout, and unwind. When I got home, I parked my car in the driveway and headed inside. My house is a small, one-story place with just enough space for me. I've lived alone here for the past 3 years. It's not in a busy area, which I like because it's quiet and I can always find peace after a long day at work. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was dark, just as I expected. I turned on the light in the hallway and kicked off my shoes, enjoying the feeling of finally being home. The familiar scent of the house greeted me, and I felt a sense of comfort. I made my way to the living room and tossed my bag onto the couch. As I walked to the kitchen to grab a drink, something caught my eye. There was a faint light coming from the kitchen. At first I thought it might be the glow of the streetlights outside, but it was too bright for that. I had made sure to turn off all the lights before leaving for work in the morning, so this didn't make sense. I felt a slight unease, but brushed it off. Maybe I had forgotten to turn off the light. It was a long day at work, after all. But as I approached the kitchen, the unease grew stronger. The light wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from the direction of my refrigerator. I walked into the kitchen slowly, my footsteps soft on the floor. The light was coming from the open door of the freezer. My heart started to race. I was sure I'd closed it. Who would leave a freezer door open? I didn't live with anyone. I was the only one who had a key to the house. Suddenly, the comforting quietness of my home felt eerie. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing in front of the freezer, his back to me. He was dressed in dark, dirty clothes, and his hands were inside the freezer as if he were looking for something. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze in place. This couldn't be real. How could someone be in my house? My mind raced with questions, but there was no time to think. Without making a sound, I slowly backed away from the kitchen. The man hadn't noticed me yet, but I didn't want to take any chances. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I moved quickly and quietly down the hallway toward my bedroom. Once I was inside, I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I turned the key. I stood there for a moment, my back against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was in a whirl. How did he get in? Why was he messing with my freezer? None of it made any sense, but I couldn't stay frozen in fear. I had to do something. My phone was on the nightstand by my bed. I grabbed it with shaky hands and dialed 911. My voice quivered as I explained the situation to the operator. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I kept the lights off in my room, afraid that any sign of movement might alert the man that I was there. I didn't know if he was still in the kitchen or if he had heard me leave. Every creak of the house made me jump. The silence was deafening, each second ticking by filled with tension. I tried to listen for any sound, but all I could hear was the rapid beating of my heart. After what felt like forever, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with fear. What if the man heard them too? What if he tried to escape, or worse, come after me? I couldn't stop my thoughts from spiraling. Finally, I heard the sound of the front door being forced open, followed by heavy footsteps. The police had arrived. I unlocked my bedroom door and slowly opened it, peeking out into the hallway. I could see the beam of a flashlight scanning the walls as the officers searched the house. I stepped into the hallway, relief flooding through me. "I'm here," I called back, my voice shaking. They quickly moved toward me, asking if I was okay and if I had seen the intruder. I explained everything, from the light in the kitchen to the man in the freezer. The officers searched every corner of the house, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him, not even a trace that he had been there. The police told me that it wasn't uncommon for burglars to break into homes looking for easy targets. But something about the whole situation felt off. Why was he interested in my freezer? Why didn't he take anything else? I didn't have answers, only questions that haunted me long after that night. I installed security cameras the next day and changed all the locks, but the fear stayed with me. Every time I came home from work, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be inside, waiting. The once comforting silence of my home now felt heavy, filled with the memory of that night. I never saw the man again, but I always wondered who he was and what he wanted. The police never found him, and the case went cold. But for me, the fear never went away. I still love my work, but now coming home isn't the same. The safety and peace I once felt in my house are gone, replaced by the lingering fear of the unknown. I was working late at the office, which had become a routine for me. My name is James, and I work as an accountant at a small firm. The office was quiet at night, with only the sound of my fingers tapping on the keyboard. The overhead lights cast long shadows, making the place seem even more deserted. It was the kind of silence that made you notice every small sound, like the hum of the air conditioner or the creak of the old wooden floor. It was a Thursday night, and I had a deadline to meet. The others had left hours ago, and I was the only one still at my desk. I was focused on my work, trying to wrap things up so I could finally go home. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m., and I was starting to feel the weight of the day. My eyes were heavy, and my back ached from sitting too long. As I worked, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was a flicker of movement, something that made me stop and look up. But when I turned my head, there was nothing there. I brushed it off as my tired mind played tricks on me and went back to my work. But the feeling that something was off stayed with me. The air seemed heavier and the silence more oppressive. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the late hour getting to me. About 15 minutes later, just as I was considering calling it a night, I heard a noise outside the office door. It was faint at first, a shuffling sound like someone moving around. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in my chair, listening intently. The sound came again, louder this time. like footsteps. My first thought was that maybe someone had forgotten something and come back to get it. But who would return at this hour? I slowly got up from my chair, my movements cautious. I walked over to the office door and pressed my ear against it. The footsteps had stopped and there was only silence. I hesitated, not sure whether I should open the door or stay inside. Part of me wanted to just pack up and leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. Just as I reached for the door handle, there was a loud bang, followed by a shout. My hand froze in midair. "Hands up," someone yelled. The voice was authoritative, and I knew immediately it was the police. My heart raced, and 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. Why were the police here? What had happened? I slowly opened the door, my hands trembling. 2 police officers stood in the hallway, their guns drawn and pointed in my direction. The sight of the guns made my blood run cold. I raised my hands instinctively, confusion and fear washing over me. "What's going on?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you alone?" one of the officers asked, his eyes scanning the office behind me. "Yes," I replied, my voice shaky. "I'm the only one here." The officers didn't lower their weapons. Instead, one of them stepped forward and motioned for me to move aside. "Stay where you are," he ordered. "We're here because we received a report of a break-in." My heart pounded even harder. A break-in? In the office? I glanced around, as if expecting to see the intruder standing right there in plain sight. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual clutter of papers and office equipment. "I didn't hear anything," I said, my mind racing. "Had someone broken in while I was working?" "We saw a man enter the building," the other officer explained. "He was seen heading toward this office." The officer's words sent a chill through me. I had been so engrossed in my work that I hadn't even noticed. I stepped back, allowing the officers to enter the office. They moved quickly, their eyes scanning every corner of the room. One of them checked behind the desk, while the other looked in the small storage room at the back. I stood near the doorway, my hands still raised, feeling completely out of control. "Stay calm," one of the officers said as he continued his search. "We'll find him." I watched as they methodically searched the office, opening every cupboard and looking under every piece of furniture. The minutes felt like hours, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in the middle of a bad dream. I kept thinking about how close the intruder must have been, how he could have been watching me while I worked. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of the officers called out, "Over here!" His voice was urgent, and I could see the tension in his posture. He was crouched down, looking under one of the desks near the back of the office. I held my breath as the other officer rushed over to him. They both peered under the desk, and then I saw it, the shadow of a figure hidden beneath. My stomach turned as I realized that the intruder had been in the office with me the entire time. "Come out, slowly," one of the officers commanded, his voice firm. The figure under the desk didn't move at first, but then slowly, a man crawled out. He was disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn. His eyes were wide with fear as the officers pulled him to his feet and handcuffed him. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his face pale and gaunt. I stood there, frozen, as the officers led the man out of the office. He didn't say a word, just stared blankly ahead as they took him away. The whole thing felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but it was real, terrifyingly real. After the police left with the intruder, I sat back down at my desk, my hands still shaking. The office felt different now, no longer the familiar place I had spent so many late nights in. It felt tainted, as if the shadows had come to life and swallowed up the safety I once felt here. I didn't finish my work that night. I couldn't. The thought of staying in that office for even one more minute was unbearable. I grabbed my things and left, the cold night air hitting me as I stepped outside. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but the fear lingered. That night changed the way I saw the office. I couldn't bring myself to stay late anymore, not after what had happened. The thought of that man hiding just a few feet away from me, watching me while I worked, still haunts me. I can't help but wonder what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I love traveling, and Airbnb is my go-to for finding unique places to stay. One summer, I wanted a break from city life, so I booked a small cabin in the woods. The pictures on the site showed a cozy wooden cabin surrounded by tall trees. The reviews were positive, praising the owner, Mr. Bolt, for being kind and helpful. I didn't think twice before booking it. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. The road became narrow and winding as I got closer. Trees towered over me, their branches reaching out like long fingers. The sunlight barely broke through the thick leaves, casting a dim, greenish light on the path ahead. I could feel the air getting cooler, and a sense of isolation slowly crept in. But I told myself this was the peace I wanted. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as it did in the photos. It was charming, with a small porch and a rocking chair. Flowers grew in neat rows by the front steps, adding a splash of color to the otherwise dark surroundings. I parked my car and got out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Mr. Bolt appeared from behind the cabin. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, with a friendly smile and kind eyes. He wore a plaid shirt, jeans, and a straw hat that looked well worn. He greeted me warmly and helped me with my bags. "You'll love it here," he said as he showed me around. His voice was gentle, like the soothing rustle of leaves in the wind. He pointed out the small kitchen, the cozy living room with a fireplace, and the bedroom with a large window that overlooked the forest. Everything was simple but comfortable, just what I needed. As I settled in, Mr. Bolt told me to let him know if I needed anything. He lived nearby and was always available to help. I thanked him, feeling reassured by his kindness. That first evening was peaceful. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch watching the sunset. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves. As night fell, the air grew colder, and the sky turned a deep shade of blue. I went inside, lit a fire in the fireplace, and curled up with a book. The warmth of the flames and the crackling sound made me feel cozy and safe. But as the night wore on, I started to notice things that made me uneasy. The cabin creaked and groaned as if it were alive. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering in the firelight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area. The forest was dense, with tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. I followed a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. The only sound was the crunching of leaves as I walked. I didn't see anyone else, which wasn't surprising given how remote the cabin was. But the silence felt different today, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but there was nothing. Still, the unease lingered. When I returned to the cabin, Mr. Bolt was there, tending to the flowers. He greeted me with the same warm smile, but something in his eyes looked different. They were darker, more intense. I brushed it off, blaming my nerves. That evening, I decided to relax by the fire again. As I sat there, I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, like something moving through the leaves. I listened carefully, and the sound grew louder and closer. My heart began to race. The noise stopped right outside the door. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal passing by. I went to bed, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway toward my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay there, frozen, as the footsteps stopped outside my door. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Bolt, but something was different. His kind eyes were gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying stare. His face seemed twisted, as if two different people were fighting to control it. One side looked like the friendly man I had met, while the other was distorted, angry, and menacing. I realized I was trapped in this remote cabin with him. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with thoughts of how to escape, but I was too scared to move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and left. I could hear his footsteps fading as he walked away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before I grabbed my phone and called the police. My hands trembled as I explained where I was and what had happened. The police arrived quickly, considering how far away the cabin was. They found Mr. Bolt in the woods, hiding among the trees. When they arrested him, They discovered he had a history of mental illness and had been living in the woods for years, pretending to be different people. The kind Mr. Bolt was just one of his personalities. The other was something far more dangerous. As I drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The cabin, the woods, and Mr. Bolt were all behind me, but the memory of that twisted face stayed with me. I will never forget when I realized the man who had seemed so kind was hiding something terrifying. A few weeks ago, I decided to go camping alone in a remote forest. I had been working hard and needed some time to clear my head. The idea of being surrounded by nature with no one around was comforting. So I packed my gear and drove out to a forest I had heard about from a friend. It was far from the city, and not many people knew about it, which made it the perfect spot for some peace. When I arrived at the forest, the sun was still high in the sky. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves creating a beautiful green canopy above. The air was fresh, and I could hear birds singing in the distance. There was a small creek nearby, and the sound of the water flowing over the rocks was soothing. I found a nice spot to set up my camp near the creek, surrounded by tall pines. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire, and sat down to enjoy the view. As the sun began to set, the forest became even more peaceful. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, and the air grew cooler. I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal, enjoying the warmth of the flames as the night grew darker. The stars started to appear, twinkling brightly above the treetops. It was a perfect night, and I felt at ease being alone in the wilderness. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The crickets were chirping, and now and then, I could hear the rustle of leaves as small animals moved around in the underbrush. It was calm and quiet, just the way I liked it. Eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. The night was cool, but I was warm and comfortable inside the tent. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to the sound of voices outside my tent. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I realized that the voices were real. My heart started to race as I lay still, listening. Two men were standing just outside my camp. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them talking in low voices. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" one of them asked. His voice was deep and rough. "Yes, this is it. I saw him set up his camp here earlier," the other man replied. His voice was quieter, almost nervous. I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead as I listened. Who were these men? What did they want? I stayed as quiet as possible, hoping they would go away. "Look, I think we should just kill him," the first man said, his voice cold and emotionless. "It's easier and no one will find him out here." My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These men were talking about killing me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I make a run for it? Should I try to scare them off? I didn't know if they had weapons, and the thought of running into the darkness was terrifying. "No," the second man said firmly. "We're not killing anyone tonight. We'll find someone else, someone easier. Let's just leave him alone." For a moment, there was silence. I held my breath, waiting to hear what they would do next. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I was afraid they might hear it. "Fine," the first man finally said, his voice filled with frustration. "But if we don't find anyone else, we're coming back." I heard them walking away, their footsteps fading into the distance. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still, waiting for what felt like hours until I was sure they were gone. My mind was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. Eventually, I dared to sit up in my tent, listening carefully for any signs that they might return. All I could hear was the sound of the creek and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, my thoughts racing. What if they came back? What if they found someone else? The fear kept me alert, my mind replaying their conversation over and over. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I quickly packed up my camp. I didn't want to stay in that forest for another minute. The beauty of the place that had once comforted me now felt sinister and dangerous. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. As I made my way back to my car, the forest seemed different. The trees that had once seemed so majestic now felt like they were closing in on me. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those men watching me from the shadows. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and got in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and drove away from the forest. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on the main road. Even then, the memory of those men's voices haunted me. Camping alone had always been something I enjoyed, but after that night, I wasn't sure if I could ever do it again. The carnival was my escape from the everyday world. I was just a young boy when I started working there, a place full of colors, lights, and excitement. The music played loud, blending with the sound of laughter, the hum of the rides, and the sweet scent of cotton candy filling the air. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, making the carnival lights glow even brighter. I worked at the game booths, where people lined up to test their luck. My job was simple: hand out the prizes, collect the tickets, and sometimes show a customer how to play the game. The games were all the same: ring toss, shooting hoops, knocking down bottles, but the thrill on the faces of those who won kept it exciting. I liked watching their eyes light up when they won a stuffed bear or a shiny toy. It made me feel like I was part of something special. But as the night went on, the carnival began to change. The bright, cheerful atmosphere took on a different tone. The shadows grew longer, and the noise seemed to dull, turning into a low murmur. The people still laughed and cheered, but something felt off. It was as if the carnival had two sides, one that was fun and lively during the day, and another that was dark and eerie at night. It was a late evening when I first noticed him. He was standing near the edge of the carnival, just outside the circle of lights. He was tall and thin, with a face hidden in the shadows. He didn't join the crowd, didn't play any games, or ride the rides. He just stood there watching. I tried to ignore him at first. After all, people came to the carnival for all sorts of reasons. Maybe he was just shy or waiting for someone. But as the night went on, I kept seeing him. No matter where I was, whether I was at the ring toss, helping a kid with the dart game, or taking a break near the food stands, I felt his eyes on me. I began to feel uneasy. My skin prickled every time I caught sight of him. He stayed in the shadows, always watching, always there. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was there for me, that he was following me. The carnival started to close, the lights dimming one by one, the music fading into the background. The crowd thinned out, and the once lively place became eerily quiet. I packed up the booth, trying to keep my hands from shaking. The man was still there, standing just outside the glow of the last few lights. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I hurried through my work, wanting nothing more than to leave, to get away from the carnival and the man who was watching me. As I walked towards the exit, I glanced back one last time. The man was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. When I turned around, he was standing there, just a few feet away. His face was still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart raced, and I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stood frozen, staring at the man as he slowly stepped closer. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, like he knew he had all the time in the world. I didn't know what he wanted, and I didn't want to find out. Somehow I managed to move, my legs finally obeying. I turned and ran, not looking back, not daring to see if he was following. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I sprinted through the now empty carnival. I reached the main road, the lights of the carnival far behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stopped, doubling over to catch my breath. I was safe, far away from the carnival and the man who had been watching me. But the fear lingered, making my hands tremble and my stomach twist. I walked home that night, the darkness around me feeling more oppressive than ever. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there, following me. But the road was empty, and I was alone. When I finally reached home, I locked the door behind me, checking it twice to make sure it was secure. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, didn't want to admit that I had been scared by a man who might have been just another carnival goer. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. He was something else, something that didn't belong in the bright, happy world of the carnival. The next day, I went back to work, trying to push the memory of the man out of my mind. But the carnival didn't feel the same anymore. The colors weren't as bright, the music wasn't as cheerful, and the shadows seemed darker than before. I kept looking for him, expecting to see him standing in the same spot, watching me. But he was gone. The carnival moved on to the next town a few days later, and I left with it. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can still feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking, following me through the shadows of the carnival. And I still haven't told anyone. Some things are better left unsaid. In 2019, my grandmother became very sick. She had always been healthy and full of life, but now she was in the hospital, and the doctors were saying that she might not make it. It was a hard time for my family. We all loved Grandma so much, and the thought of losing her was too painful to imagine. One evening, my parents decided to visit Grandma in the hospital. She wasn't doing well, and they wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. My mom and dad asked if I wanted to come with them, but I felt nervous about seeing her like that. So I told them I would stay home. They didn't argue. They knew how I felt, and they promised they wouldn't be gone too long. Before they left, my mom gave me a big hug and told me to lock all the doors and windows. "We'll be back soon," she said. "Call us if you need anything." After they left, the house felt eerily quiet. The silence made me a little uneasy, but I tried to push the feeling away. I decided to watch a movie to take my mind off things. I grabbed a blanket and settled on the couch, picking a movie I had seen a million times before. Something light and funny, just what I needed to forget about everything for a little while. As I watched the movie, I began to relax. The familiar scenes made me feel a little better, and I even started to laugh at the jokes. But then something strange happened. About halfway through the movie, I felt a weird sensation, like something wasn't right. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, but it made my heart race a little. At first, I ignored it. I told myself I was just being paranoid because I was alone in the house. But the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger. It was as if someone was watching me. I looked around the room, but everything seemed normal. The doors were still locked, and the windows were closed. I tried to focus on the movie again, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Then out of nowhere, I heard a soft noise. It was faint, like a whisper or a quiet rustle, and it seemed to be coming from right beneath me. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, listening carefully. I didn't want to believe it, but the sound was coming from under the couch. Slowly, I pulled the blanket closer and leaned forward. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, but I knew I had to check. The space under the couch was dark, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining things. But then as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. Movement. There was something, or rather someone, under the couch. I gasped and quickly moved back, almost falling off the couch in my panic. My mind raced. Who was under there? How did they get in? 1,000 questions filled my head, but there was no time to think. I had to get out of the house. I jumped off the couch and ran to the front door as fast as I could. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, but I finally managed to get the door open. I bolted out of the house, not even bothering to close the door behind me. My only thought was to get as far away as possible. I ran to my neighbor's house, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I pounded on their door, praying they were home. After what felt like forever, the door opened, and Mrs. Green, my elderly neighbor, appeared. She looked at me with concern. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked. "There's someone in my house," I blurted out, unable to keep the fear out of my voice. Mrs. Green's eyes widened, and she quickly ushered me inside. She locked the door behind us and immediately called the police. As we waited for them to arrive, she tried to calm me down, but I was too scared to think straight. My mind kept replaying the image of that figure under the couch. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. They were quick and professional, searching the house from top to bottom. I stayed at Mrs. Green's, watching from the window as the officers moved through my house with flashlights. But after what felt like hours, they came back with unsettling news. They didn't find anyone. The man under the couch was gone. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The police assured me that the house was safe, but I could tell they were as puzzled as I was. They didn't know how he had gotten in. My parents came home soon after the police left. They were shocked and terrified when they heard what had happened. My mom hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes, while my dad talked to the officers, trying to make sense of it all. But there were no answers. The man's intentions remained a mystery. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. and I kept thinking about the man under the couch. Who was he? What did he want? The questions haunted me, and the fact that we would never know the answers made it even worse. I couldn't stay home alone for a long time after that, and even now, I'm always extra careful about locking doors and windows. The memory of that night still lingers in the back of my mind, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't explain. It was 2020. I decided to take a break from my busy life and spend some time alone in nature. I packed my RV van with everything I needed and drove deep into the forest. The air was cool and the tall trees surrounded me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It felt like the perfect place to unwind and clear my mind. The forest was peaceful, and I thought a few days here would do me good. I found a spot that seemed just right, quiet, secluded, and far from any other campers. I parked my RV in a small clearing where the trees formed a natural wall around me. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. I set up a small fire outside, cooked some dinner, and enjoyed the evening sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. As the night grew darker, I put out the fire and went inside the RV. The interior was cozy, with a small bed, a table, and a few chairs. I locked the door and drew the curtains, shutting out the dark forest. The only light inside came from a small lamp on the table. I changed into my pajamas, climbed into bed, and wrapped myself in a warm blanket. I felt safe inside the RV, with the thick metal walls protecting me from the outside world. It was just after midnight when I heard the first sound. A soft knock on the window beside my bed. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. The knock was gentle, almost like someone tapping with their fingers, but it was loud enough to wake me up. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. The forest outside was silent. No wind, no animals, nothing but that knock. I hesitated, unsure if I should check. Maybe it was just a branch tapping against the window, but something about it didn't feel right. Slowly, I got out of bed and walked to the window. I pulled the curtain back just a little, enough to peek outside. There was nothing there, just the dark trees standing still under the pale moonlight. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking I must have imagined it. I closed the curtain and went back to bed, trying to calm my nerves, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining to catch any sound. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, I wasn't sure. But just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again. The same soft knock on the window. This time it was followed by another sound. A low, faint crying. It was distant at first, like it was coming from far away, but then it grew louder, closer. The sound was eerie, sending a chill through me. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The crying was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Soft, sorrowful, like someone was in deep pain. I couldn't ignore it. I had to see what was going on. I got out of bed and walked back to the window. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. Slowly, I pulled it back. What I saw made my blood run cold. Outside the window, just a few feet away, stood a shadowy figure. It was tall and thin, with long, stringy hair hanging over its face. The figure was barely visible in the darkness, but its eyes, those eyes, were large, glowing white, and staring straight at me. They were the most terrifying eyes I had ever seen, wide open, unblinking, and full of something I couldn't understand. Anger, I couldn't tell, but whatever it was, it made me back away from the window in terror. The figure didn't move. It just stood there staring at me, the crying sound coming from its direction. I felt my heart beating so fast I thought it might burst. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I run? Hide, call for help? But deep down, I knew there was only one thing I could do. I rushed to the front of the RV, my hands shaking as I grabbed the keys. I fumbled with them, my fingers almost too numb with fear to turn the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I threw the RV into gear. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and the RV lurched forward, speeding out of the clearing and onto the narrow forest road. The tires kicked up dirt and gravel as I drove as fast as I could, the headlights cutting through the dark trees that seemed to close in around me. The road twisted and turned, but I didn't slow down. My only thought was to get out of the forest, away from that thing, whatever it was. The RV bounced over the rough road, and I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the edge of the forest. The trees thinned out, and the open road stretched ahead of me. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small town miles away. Only then did I pull over, my hands still shaking, my heart pounding. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light, a shadow in the dark? But those eyes, I couldn't forget those eyes. They were burned into my memory, staring at me, full of something that I never wanted to see again. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. Whatever I saw that night, I didn't want to know what it was. All I know is that I was lucky to get out of there. Sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear that soft knock on the window, and I remember those eyes staring back at me. I hope I never see them again. I have always been a practical man. I grew up in the city, surrounded by noise and people. So when I decided to buy a farmhouse in the countryside, everyone was surprised. The idea of living in a quiet place, away from the hustle and bustle, seemed perfect. I wanted to escape the chaos and live a simple life. The farmhouse was old, but it had character. It sat on several acres of land, with tall trees surrounding it like silent guardians. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and at night, the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my days fixing up the old place, painting walls, repairing the roof, and clearing out the overgrown garden. There was something satisfying about working with my hands, and I enjoyed the quiet evenings, sitting on the porch, watching the sunset behind the hills. But then, strange things started happening. At first, I dismissed them as nothing. Old houses make noises, I told myself. They creak and groan as they settle. But soon, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. It began with small things. I would leave a tool in one room, only to find it in another. Sometimes, I would hear footsteps upstairs when I knew I was alone in the house. They were soft, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. I would rush upstairs, only to find nothing but silence. The footsteps would stop the moment I reached the top of the stairs, as if whatever was making them didn't want to be found. One night, I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. The farmhouse didn't have modern conveniences, so I had to heat water on the stove and use a basin. As I was scrubbing a plate, I heard a faint whisper behind me. It was so soft that I thought I had imagined it. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but the kitchen was empty. The whisper came again, this time closer, almost in my ear. My heart raced, and I dropped the plate, which shattered on the floor. I stood there frozen, listening, but the whispering had stopped. The only sound was the wind outside, rattling the window panes. I told myself I was just tired, that I had been working too. But something was in the house with me, something I couldn't see. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle of the wind made me jump. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, pressing in on me from all sides. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining to catch any sound. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the feeling of something cold brushing against my arm. I jerked awake, sitting up in bed, but there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to ignore what had happened. I wasn't going to let fear get the best of me. I went about my day as usual, working on the farmhouse and trying to push the events of the previous night out of my mind. But as evening fell, the uneasy feeling returned. I tried to stay busy, but the quiet of the house felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on me. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep would come quickly, but it didn't. I lay there, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the wind outside. And then I heard it again, the whispering. This time it was louder, clearer. It was a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The whispering continued, growing more insistent, like someone was trying to tell me something. I got out of bed, my hands shaking, and slowly walked down the hallway. The whispering followed me, filling the air around me. It was coming from the living room. I stopped at the doorway, peering inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. But there, in the middle of the room, was a figure. It was a shadow, darker than the darkness around it. It stood there, motionless, staring at me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me. I wanted to run, to leave the farmhouse and never come back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the shadowy figure. It didn't move, but the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It was coming from the figure, I realized. It was trying to communicate with me, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. Finally, I found the strength to move. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the figure. The whispering followed me as I retreated down the hallway, growing fainter with each step. I reached my bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it. I sat on the bed, my heart racing, my mind reeling. What was happening? Was I going crazy? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, staring at the door, waiting for the whispering to return. But it didn't. The house was silent, but it was a heavy, oppressive silence, like the calm before a storm. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was in this house didn't want me here. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the farmhouse. I didn't look back as I drove away, the shadowy figure and the whispering voice still fresh in my mind. I sold the farmhouse a few weeks later without ever returning. I didn't tell the new owners about what I had experienced. Who would believe me? I hardly believed it myself. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened in that farmhouse. All I know is that something was there, something unseen and unknown, and it didn't want me there. My name is Watson, and I live in a small, quiet town where everyone knows each other. I enjoy hosting dinner parties at my house and bringing friends together for good food and conversation. It was a warm summer evening when I decided to host another dinner party, inviting my closest friends. I had no idea that this night would turn into a mystery that still haunts me. I spent the entire day preparing for the party. The table was set with my best dishes, and the house smelled of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow through the windows as my friends started to arrive. Sarah, Mark, Lisa, and John were all there, along with a new friend, Tom, who had recently moved to town. Tom was a bit of a mystery. He was quiet and reserved, but I thought it would be nice to include him in our group. He seemed happy to be invited, and I hoped he would enjoy the evening with us. We all gathered around the table, laughing and sharing stories as we ate. The dinner went smoothly, with everyone enjoying the food and each other's company. After dessert, we moved to the living room to continue our conversations. Tom was unusually quiet, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he was just shy, or perhaps he didn't feel comfortable yet. As the evening progressed, Tom's mood seemed to shift. He became tense and irritable, barely speaking and avoiding eye contact. I noticed but didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable by asking in front of everyone. Eventually, he stood up abruptly, muttering something about needing to leave. Before I could say anything, he was out the door, slamming it behind him. We all sat in stunned silence, unsure of what had just happened. After a few moments, we tried to brush it off and continued the evening, though the mood had shifted. The night eventually came to an end, and my friends said their goodbyes, still puzzled by Tom's sudden departure. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check on Tom, hoping to find out what had upset him. I went to his house, but there was no answer when I knocked. His car was in the driveway, but it seemed as if no one was home. I left, thinking he might just need some space. A few days passed, and I still hadn't heard from Tom. I reached out to my friends, but no one had seen or heard from him either. Concerned, I decided to call the police and report him missing. They took my statement and assured me they would look into it. Weeks turned into months, and there was still no sign of Tom. The police had searched his house, talked to neighbors, and followed every lead, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. My friends and I were left with more questions than answers. One evening, I found myself going through the events of that night over and over in my mind. What had caused Tom to leave so suddenly? I couldn't help but feel responsible, wondering if I had missed some sign, or if there was something I could have done to prevent it. Determined to find some answers, I started looking into Tom's past. I learned that he had moved to our town after a difficult breakup and was looking for a fresh start. He didn't have many friends, and his family lived far away. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I knew about him. One night, while I was alone in my house, I heard a noise outside. It was a faint rustling, like someone was moving through the bushes. My heart raced as I peered out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The noise stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. The following nights, the noises continued. Footsteps, whispers, and the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. My sleep was disturbed, and I felt on edge all the time. One evening, I found an old journal in Tom's house that the police had overlooked. It was filled with his thoughts and feelings, revealing a troubled mind. He wrote about feeling out of place, not just in our town, but in life. The entries grew darker, filled with paranoia and fear. The last entry was dated the night of the dinner party. It read, "I can't escape it. It's always watching, always waiting. I need to leave before it's too late." Reading those words sent a chill down my spine. What had Tom been so afraid of? I shared the journal with the police, but it didn't provide any concrete answers. They continued their investigation, but the trail had gone cold. As time passed, the memory of that night faded for everyone except me. I couldn't let it go, haunted by the unknown. I often found myself staring out into the darkness, listening for those faint noises, wondering if Tom was out there somewhere, lost and scared. My friends tried to comfort me, but the mystery remained unsolved. Tom was gone, and we might never know what happened to him. The dinner party that had ended happily for the rest of us had left a shadow over my life, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary moments can turn into the most inexplicable mysteries. In the quiet moments, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I still think of Tom and that fateful night. The unanswered questions linger, a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. And so, I continue to search for answers, hoping that one day, the mystery will be solved and Tom's story will finally have an ending. A few years ago, my son, Alex, was brought home late one night by his friend James. Alex was 20 at the time and had been out with friends. I was already in bed when I heard the front door open. I quickly got up to check what was happening. I saw James struggling to hold Alex up as I reached the living room. Alex was very drunk, barely able to stand on his own. His clothes were disheveled, and his eyes were half closed. James was a tall, muscular young man who seemed to handle Alex's weight easily. "Sorry about this," James said, his voice steady. "Alex had a bit too much to drink." I nodded, my concern for my son overshadowing any frustration I might have felt. "Let's get him to his room," I said, moving to help. Together, we managed to get Alex up the stairs and into his bed. He mumbled incoherently, his head lolling to the side. I pulled off his shoes and tucked him in, hoping he would sleep it off and feel better in the morning. James watched for a moment before turning to leave. "Thanks for bringing him home," I said, feeling more relieved now that Alex was safe. "No problem," James replied with a small smile. "I'll check on him tomorrow." With that, James left, and I went back to my room, hoping for some sleep. The next day, Alex was groggy but otherwise fine. He didn't remember much from the previous night, just that he had been out with friends and had too much to drink. Life went on as usual, and I didn't think much more about that night. A year later, everything changed. One evening, I was watching the news when a breaking story caught my attention. The reporter was standing in front of a hotel, describing a horrific crime that had taken place. My heart sank as I listened. "A young man was found dead in his hotel room earlier today," the reporter said. "The victim, whose name has not been released, was reportedly checked into the hotel by a friend the previous night. Police are now searching for the friend, who is considered a suspect." I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the story seemed disturbingly familiar. I watched, horrified, as the reporter continued. "According to witnesses, the suspect was seen leaving the hotel early this morning. The police have released this sketch of the suspect. The screen showed a drawing of a man who looked eerily like James. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. Could it be him? The thought was almost too much to bear. I immediately called Alex. He answered on the third ring, his voice sleepy. "Alex, turn on the news," I said urgently. "There's something you need to see." A few minutes later, he called back, his voice now fully awake and filled with shock. "What do we do?" "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. "We need to call the police." We did just that, and soon, detectives were at our house asking questions about James. Alex told them everything he knew about the night James brought him home drunk and how they had been friends for years. The detectives took notes, their faces serious. Days turned into weeks as the search for James continued. The story was all over the news, and everyone in our small town was talking about it. The more I learned, the more horrified I became. James had not only gotten his friend drunk, but had also checked them into the hotel, only to kill them and escape. The brutality of the crime was unimaginable. Alex was deeply affected by the news. He couldn't believe that his friend, someone he had trusted, could do something so terrible. He became withdrawn, spending most of his time in his room. I tried to comfort him, but there were no words that could make the situation better. One night, a few weeks after the news broke, Alex and I were sitting in the living room. The house was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Alex was staring at the floor, lost in thought. "Mom," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Do you think I could have been next?" The question hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. I didn't know what to say. The thought had crossed my mind too many times, and it was something I tried to push away. "I don't know, Alex," I said softly, "but you're safe now, and that's what matters." The police eventually found James. He had fled to a neighboring state and was hiding out in a rundown motel. His capture brought some relief, but the scars he left behind were deep. The trial was long and painful, with details of the crime coming to light that were almost too much to bear. In the end, James was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But for Alex and me, life would never be the same. The fear and betrayal we felt lingered, casting a shadow over our days. Alex struggled to move on, haunted by the knowledge that someone he had considered a friend was capable of such evil. Years have passed since then, but the memories remain. Alex has tried to rebuild his life, but there are moments when I see the pain in his eyes, a reminder of the nightmare we lived through. The experience taught us both a hard lesson about trust and the darkness that can hide within people we think we know. We still talk about that night sometimes, the night James brought Alex home. It serves as a stark reminder of how close we came to losing everything. And though we've tried to move forward, the shadows of that time are never far behind. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. Last September, my friends and I decided to go for a night drive. We were bored and wanted an adventure. It was a cold, clear night, and the moonlight made the empty roads look mysterious. There were 4 of us in the car, me, Alex, Sam, and Jenny. We drove aimlessly, laughing and playing music, but soon the conversation turned to ghost stories. Someone mentioned an old abandoned house at the edge of town. "We should go there," Sam suggested with a grin. The idea was thrilling and scary at the same time. We all agreed, and Alex, who was driving, turned the car in the direction of the house. The roads became narrower and bumpier as we got closer. Tall trees lined the path, their branches looking like twisted fingers in the moonlight. Finally, we saw it, the old abandoned house. It stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by overgrown bushes and tall grass. The house was large, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked like it had been empty for years. The car's headlights cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the house look even scarier. We parked the car a little way down the road, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves. As we walked towards the house, the air felt colder, and I could hear the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel. My heart was beating fast, and I could tell my friends were nervous too. We reached the front door, which was hanging off its hinges. Alex pushed it open with a creak, and we stepped inside. The air inside was musty and stale. The moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows on the dusty floor. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. We split up to explore. Jenny and I went upstairs while Alex and Sam stayed on the ground floor. The stairs groaned under our weight as we climbed. Each step echoed through the empty house. Upstairs, we found old furniture covered in white sheets, broken picture frames, and cobwebs in every corner. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jenny and I moved from room to room, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. In one of the rooms, I found an old diary on a dusty table. I picked it up and opened it, but the pages were too faded to read. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from downstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. "Alex, Sam," Jenny called out, but there was no answer. We hurried back down the stairs. The living room was empty, but the front door was now closed. We hadn't heard it shut. A sense of dread washed over me. Something wasn't right. "Let's find them and get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We moved through the house, checking each room. The kitchen was empty, and so was the dining room. As we entered the last room, a small storage space at the back of the house, we found Alex and Sam. They were standing still, staring at something on the floor. I followed their gaze and saw what they were looking at: a trapdoor. "Did you open it?" I asked. Sam shook his head. "It was already open when we got here." A cold draft came up from the trapdoor, sending shivers down my spine. Darkness below seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. Against my better judgment, we decided to go down. The narrow wooden ladder creaked as we descended into the basement. The basement was damp and cold. The walls were lined with shelves full of dusty jars and old tools. In the corner, there was a small, flickering light. We cautiously approached it and found an old lantern hanging from a nail in the wall. It cast a dim glow, barely illuminating the room. Suddenly, we heard footsteps above us. Someone else was in the house. My heart pounded in my chest. We turned off our flashlights and stood still, listening. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to the trapdoor. We held our breath, hoping whoever it was would leave. But the footsteps stopped right above us. Then, slowly, the trapdoor began to creak open. A figure appeared at the top of the ladder, silhouetted against the dim light from the living room. It was a man, tall and thin, with wild hair and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. He climbed down the ladder, and we backed away, trying to stay out of his sight. The man moved slowly, methodically, as if he was searching for something. He muttered to himself, words we couldn't understand. I could feel my friends trembling beside me. We needed to get out of there, but the only way was past the man. Suddenly, the man stopped and turned his head, looking directly at us. His eyes locked onto mine and a cold smile spread across his face. He started walking towards us and panic set in. We bolted for the ladder, scrambling up as fast as we could. Alex went first, followed by Jenny, then me, and finally Sam. As we reached the top, the man grabbed Sam's ankle, pulling him back down. Sam kicked and struggled, and we all grabbed him, pulling him with all our strength. Sam managed to break free, and we slammed the trapdoor shut, locking it with a rusty bolt. We didn't stop to catch our breath. We ran out of the house, through the front door, and back to the car. We jumped in, and Alex started the engine. The tires screeched as we sped away, not looking back. As we drove away, the house disappeared into the darkness behind us. We didn't speak, too shaken by what had just happened. The thrill of the night drive had turned into a nightmare. We had found our adventure, but it was one we would never want to repeat. From that night on, we never spoke of the abandoned house again. The memory of the man and his eerie smile haunted me for weeks. Even now, when I drive past the edge of town, I feel a chill and speed up, not wanting to be reminded of that terrifying night. I worked the night shift at a quiet gas station in New Hampshire. The job was simple. My duties included stocking shelves, cleaning, and handling the register. The nights were usually calm, with only a few customers stopping by to fill up their tanks or grab a snack. One night, as I was preparing to close up, I noticed the air felt different. There was a strange stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. As the clock neared midnight, an old car pulled up to the pump. Out stepped an elderly man wearing khakis and a button-down shirt. His white hair was neatly combed, and he moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He walked into the store, and I greeted him with a smile. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" I asked. He nodded politely and walked around the store, browsing the shelves. I went back to my tasks, wiping down the counter and straightening the magazines. After a few minutes, he approached the counter with a small bottle of water and a pack of gum. "Will that be all?" I asked, ringing up his items. He nodded again, his eyes fixed on mine. Something was unsettling about his gaze, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As I handed him his change, he reached out and gripped my wrist. His touch was cold, and I felt a shiver run through me. "Hell is a real place," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "And the devil has already got his hand on you, girl. Be careful." I froze, staring at him in shock. His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. He released my wrist, took his items, and walked out of the store without another word. I watched him drive away, the taillights of his car disappearing into the darkness. For a moment I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. His words echoed in my mind, sending chills down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to my work, but the unease lingered. I finished my shift and locked up the store, but I couldn't stop thinking about the old man. His warning played over and over in my head, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What did he mean? Why did he say that to me? As I drove home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the old man's car following me. The night seemed darker than usual, and every shadow felt menacing. When I finally reached my apartment, I quickly locked the door behind me and checked all the windows. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak and groan of the building made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The old man's warning haunted my dreams, and I woke up several times in a cold sweat. The next day, I told my coworker about the encounter. He laughed it off, saying the old man was probably just crazy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. I felt a heavy weight on my chest, as if a dark cloud was hanging over me. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of the old man's warning started to fade. Life went on as usual, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease every time I worked the night shift. One night, as I was restocking the shelves, I heard a faint whisper. I turned around, but there was no one there. I shrugged it off as my imagination and went back to work. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all around me, and I couldn't make out the words. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of dread grew stronger. I felt a chill in the air, and my heart started to race. I looked around the store, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The lights flickered for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. My breath came in short gasps, and I felt a surge of panic. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with their insistent murmur. I ran to the front of the store and grabbed my phone, dialing my coworker's number with trembling fingers. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. The memory of the old man's warning came rushing back, and I felt a sense of terror grip my heart. Just then, the door chime rang, and I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was the old man, his eyes fixed on mine. He walked slowly towards me, his footsteps echoing in the empty store. "Hell is a real place," he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. "And the devil has already got his hand on you, girl. Be careful." I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The old man's gaze was intense, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. He reached out and touched my wrist, his grip cold and unyielding. "Be careful," he repeated, his voice a whisper. I felt a surge of panic and pulled away, stumbling backward. The old man's eyes seemed to bore into my soul, and I felt a sense of impending doom. I turned and ran out of the store, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove home in a daze, the old man's warning echoing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, and I felt a heavy weight on my chest. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed on the couch, my heart racing. That night I couldn't sleep. The old man's words haunted me, and I felt a sense of terror that I couldn't explain. The next day, I called in sick and stayed home, too afraid to go back to work. I never saw the old man again, but his warning stayed with me. The memory of that night still sends chills down my spine, and I can't shake the feeling that something dark is watching me. I don't know if the old man was crazy or if his warning was real, but I'll never forget the fear I felt that night at the gas station. My name is John, and I enjoy taking my family on little adventures. We live in the city, so sometimes we like to escape to the countryside. One summer, I rented an old farmhouse on Airbnb. It looked perfect, big yard, old charm, and even a pool. It was a great spot to relax and unwind for a weekend. We arrived on a sunny Friday afternoon. My wife, Julian, and our two kids, Liam and Zoe, were excited. The farmhouse stood at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by trees. It had a wide porch with creaky wooden steps, and the inside was full of antique furniture and old pictures. It felt like stepping back in time. After unpacking, we decided to spend the evening by the pool. The kids splashed around while Julian and I sat on the edge, dipping our feet in the cool water. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the kids' laughter and the gentle rustling of leaves. As night fell, we set up some lights around the pool and had dinner outside. The stars were bright, and everything seemed perfect. But then I heard it, a crunching sound, like someone walking on dry leaves. I looked around, but it was dark beyond the reach of our lights. Julian noticed my concern. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "I'm sure it's just an animal," she replied, trying to sound calm. But the sounds continued, and they seemed to be getting closer. I told the kids to get out of the pool and go inside. We gathered our things quickly, and I locked the door behind us. Inside, the house felt safe, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. Julian and I put the kids to bed, and I kept a flashlight and my phone nearby. Hours passed, and the house was quiet. Just as I started to relax, there was a loud knock at the door. My heart jumped. I grabbed the flashlight and looked through the peephole. A man stood outside, wearing a police uniform. "Open up, it's the police," he called out. I hesitated. Why would the police be here at this hour? I decided to call out through the door. "Why are you here?" I asked. "There's been a report of suspicious activity. Please open the door," he replied. Something didn't feel right. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. I decided to call the local police station to verify. As I dialed, the man outside knocked again, harder this time. "Open the door now," he shouted. The dispatcher at the police station answered, and I quickly explained the situation. They said they hadn't sent anyone to our location and advised me to stay inside and lock everything. They were sending real officers to our address. Fear gripped me. I told Julian to take the kids and hide in one of the bedrooms. I could hear the man outside trying the door handle. I went to the living room and turned off all the lights, peeking through the curtains. More figures were moving around outside. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. The knocking continued, and the man claimed to be the police, demanding we open the door. I knew he wasn't telling the truth. My phone buzzed. The real police were almost there. Suddenly, the fake officers started banging on the windows, trying to find a way in. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't break the glass. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car coming down the long driveway. The figures outside scattered into the woods. Real police officers arrived and checked the area. They found no sign of the imposters. They assured us we were safe, but suggested we find another place to stay for the night. They said it wasn't common, but sometimes people posed as officers to gain entry to homes. Their intentions were unknown, but it was clear they meant no good. We packed our bags and left the farmhouse, heading to a nearby hotel. The kids were scared but safe. Julian and I were shaken but relieved. As we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if we had opened the door. It was a frightening experience that reminded me to always trust my instincts and verify before letting anyone in. We never found out who the fake police were or what they wanted, but we were thankful for the real officers who arrived just in time. That night changed the way I think about safety, and I'm more cautious now, especially when renting places in unfamiliar areas. Our little adventure turned into a night of terror, but we were lucky to come out of it unharmed. It was a lesson learned, and from then on, I made sure to always double-check everything and stay alert, no matter how safe a place seemed. In 2016, I had a strange experience that still haunts me. It was a Saturday night, and I was feeling exhausted after a long week of work. I decided to go to bed early, hoping to catch up on some much-needed sleep. My small apartment was quiet, with only the occasional hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. I crawled into bed around 9 p.m., pulling the covers up to my chin. I closed my eyes and soon drifted off into a deep sleep. My dreams were vivid, filled with strange and unsettling images, but I couldn't wake up. It felt like I was trapped in my sleep, unable to move or open my eyes. When I finally woke up, it was still dark outside. I reached for my phone on the nightstand to check the time. It was 3:33 a.m. I groggily sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes. As I looked around the room, I noticed something that made my heart race. There was another bed in my room, right next to mine. I was sure it wasn't there when I went to sleep. My apartment was small, just a one-bedroom unit, and there was no space for an extra bed. I blinked several times, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the bed was still there. It was identical to mine, with white sheets and a dark wooden frame. But what terrified me was the figure lying in the bed. Someone was under the white sheet, completely still. The sheet was pulled up over their head, so I couldn't see their face. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I stared at the figure. Who could it be? No one else had keys to my apartment, and I hadn't invited anyone over. I wanted to scream, but my voice seemed stuck in my throat. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. Should I call the police? I quietly got out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. My heart pounded in my chest as I tiptoed to the door. I reached for the light switch, but my hand trembled so much that I missed it the first time. When I finally turned on the light, the figure didn't move. The room was now brightly lit, and I could see the sheet. It looked old and worn, with small stains on it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I slowly walked over to the bed, my eyes never leaving the figure. As I got closer, I could see that the sheet was thin, almost transparent. I could make out the shape of the person's body underneath, but their face was still hidden. My hand shook as I reached out to touch the sheet. Just as my fingers brushed against the fabric, the figure moved. I jumped back, my heart racing. The figure sat up slowly, the sheet still covering them. They turned their head towards me, and I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I was frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. The figure stood up, still wrapped in the sheet. They were tall, taller than anyone I knew. They took a step towards me, and I finally found my voice. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, silently watching me. I backed away, my mind racing with fear. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran towards the door, my hands fumbling with the lock. I could hear the figure's footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I finally managed to unlock the door and ran out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face. I leaned against the building, trying to catch my breath. My mind was spinning with questions. Who was that? How did they get into my apartment? I knew I couldn't go back in there alone, so I called the police. When the officers arrived, I explained what had happened. They looked at me with concern and asked me to wait outside while they checked the apartment. I paced back and forth, my heart still racing. After what felt like an eternity, the officers came back out. "There's no one in there," one of them said. "We checked every room. Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" I knew what I had seen, but I didn't argue. I thanked the officers and watched as they drove away. I stood there for a long time, staring up at my apartment window. Finally, I gathered the courage to go back inside. The extra bed was gone, and there was no sign of the figure. Everything was exactly as it had been before I went to sleep. I checked all the doors and windows, but they were all locked. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that whoever or whatever had been in my room had vanished without a trace. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting on the couch with all the lights on. The experience left me shaken, and I still don't have an explanation for what happened. I moved to a new apartment soon after, hoping to leave the memory behind. But sometimes late at night, I still feel like someone is watching me. And I can't help but wonder if the figure in the white sheet will ever return. I was working the graveyard shift at the gas station. The night was quiet, and I was halfway through my shift. The store was empty, except for the hum of the refrigerators and the soft buzz of the overhead lights. I was stocking some shelves when I heard the chime of the door. A woman entered, holding a young boy's hand. They both looked scared. The woman's clothes were torn, and her face was streaked with tears. The boy clung to her side, his eyes wide with fear. She approached the counter, her voice shaky. "Can I use your phone?" I nodded and handed her the store phone. As she dialed, I noticed her hands trembling. The boy stayed close to her, looking around nervously. I couldn't imagine what they had been through. The woman spoke softly into the phone, her words rushed and urgent. I tried not to eavesdrop, but couldn't help catching fragments of her conversation. She was trying to reach someone for help. After the call, she asked if they could stay in the store for a while. I could see she was desperate. "Of course," I said. "You can stay as long as you need." I offered them some free drinks and snacks. The woman's face softened a bit, and she thanked me. They sat in a corner, the boy munching on a candy bar while the woman sipped a bottle of water. I kept an eye on them, making sure they felt safe. The night dragged on, and the unease in my stomach grew. I didn't know what had happened to them, but it was clear they were running from something or someone. An hour passed. The door chimed again, this time more aggressively. A man stormed in, his face twisted with anger. "There you are," he shouted, making a beeline for the woman and the boy. The woman shrank back, pulling the boy closer. "Sir, you need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I stepped between him and the woman. "Get out of my way," he roared. "She's coming with me." He tried to push past me, but I held my ground. The woman was crying now, clutching her son protectively. "Sir, I'm calling the police," I warned. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the phone. The man's eyes flashed with rage, and he lunged at me, knocking the phone out of my hand. It clattered to the floor, but I managed to grab it and dial 911. "Help! We need police at the gas station on Elm Street," I shouted into the phone. The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity before I heard the sirens. The man continued to shout, trying to drag the woman out of the store. I stood in his way, hoping to buy time. The boy was crying now, his face buried in his mother's side. Finally, the police arrived. 2 officers burst through the door, guns drawn. "Step away from them," one officer commanded. The man hesitated, then raised his hands, his face still contorted with anger. The officers moved quickly, handcuffing him and escorting him out to the squad car. The woman collapsed onto a chair, sobbing with relief. The boy held on to her, still frightened but visibly relieved that the man was gone. One of the officers stayed behind to talk to the woman. She explained that the man was her boyfriend and had been abusive. She had finally managed to escape with her son, seeking refuge in the gas station. The officer assured her that she was safe now and that they would help her find a place to stay. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The situation had been terrifying, but I was glad I could help. The woman thanked me repeatedly, tears of gratitude in her eyes. I told her it was no problem, just glad she and her son were safe. The police took the man away, and the officer stayed with the woman until a social worker arrived. They arranged for her and her son to stay at a safe house for the night. As they left, the woman turned to me one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. I nodded, watching as they walked out into the night, finally safe from harm. The store was quiet again. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerators and the buzz of the lights. But the night felt different now. I had faced something terrifying and helped someone in need. The graveyard shift had never felt so important. As the hours passed and the morning light began to filter through the windows, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her son. I hoped they would find peace and safety in their new life. And I hoped that in some small way I had made a difference. The memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder of the strength it takes to stand up to fear and the power of kindness in the face of darkness. When I was young, I had a passion for exploring abandoned places. The mystery of old, empty buildings always called to me. The idea that these places once buzzed with life but now stood silent fascinated me. I loved the thrill of stepping into the past, seeing the decay of what was once new, and feeling the history that lingered in the air. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned school in our town. The building had been empty for years, and many stories surrounded it. People said it was haunted, and we wanted to see for ourselves if it was true. It was a night perfect for our adventure. We met up at my house and packed flashlights, snacks, and our phones. There were 4 of us, me, Tom, Lisa, and Sarah. We were all excited and a little scared. As we walked to the school, we talked about the stories we had heard. Some people said they heard strange noises inside. Others claimed to see shadows moving in the windows at night. When we reached the school, it looked even creepier than we imagined. The windows were broken, and the doors were boarded up. Vines had grown over the walls, and the paint was peeling off. The place looked like it belonged in a horror movie. We found a way in through a broken window at the back of the building. One by one, we climbed through, trying to be as quiet as possible. Once inside, we turned on our flashlights. The beams cut through the darkness, revealing dusty hallways and old lockers. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. We decided to stick together, not wanting to get lost in the maze of corridors. As we walked, our footsteps echoed loudly. Every sound seemed amplified in the empty building. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive. We started in the main hallway, where the principal's office was. The door was ajar, and we pushed it open slowly. Inside, the room was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, and the desk was overturned. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I shivered, thinking about what could have caused such chaos. Next, we moved to the classrooms. Each one was filled with old desks and chairs, some broken and others covered in dust. Books were left open on the desks, their pages yellowed with age. It felt like the students had just left and never returned. In one classroom, we found a chalkboard with strange writing on it. The words were smeared and hard to read, but it looked like some kind of warning. Tom, always the brave one, laughed it off and said it was probably just kids playing a prank. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave me. As we continued exploring, we heard a loud bang from somewhere in the building. We all froze, our hearts pounding. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. We nodded, our eyes wide with fear. We decided to investigate, even though every instinct told me to leave. We followed the sound down a long, dark hallway. The walls were lined with old photos of students and teachers, their faces smiling and happy. It felt eerie, like they were watching us. At the end of the hallway, we reached the gymnasium. The doors were closed, but we could hear strange noises coming from inside. With a deep breath, Tom pushed the doors open. The gym was huge, and our flashlights barely lit up the far corners. We stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath our feet. In the middle of the gym, we saw something that made our blood run cold. A figure stood there, dressed in old, tattered clothes. It was facing away from us, but we could see its shoulders rising and falling as if it were breathing heavily. We stood frozen, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the figure turned around, and we saw its face. It was pale and gaunt, with dark, sunken eyes. It looked right at us and let out a chilling scream. We ran. I don't remember how we got out of the gym or the building. All I remember is the pure terror that drove us to flee. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the school, panting and out of breath. We never went back to that school. The experience haunted us for a long time. We couldn't explain what we saw that night, and we didn't want to try. Our passion for exploring abandoned places was gone, replaced by the fear of what we might find. That night taught us that some places are better left alone. The abandoned school still stands, a silent reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the dark. And I, for one, am happy to leave it that way.